This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
3 minutes after 10 is the time. A very good morning indeed to you. Should we begin with a game? I'll get a quick game off the ground. This is quite a good one, actually. Missing word round. It seems to be growing in popularity. Completely unoriginal idea. It's been going on forever. But if you find the right story, they are rather splendid. There's two questions here, actually. Two questions in one. Two games in one. So here's the headline with the word cunningly removed by me. Although there have been occasions in the past when I've accidentally read out the missing word and then carried on regardless and pretended as if I hadn't. And you still got it wrong. South Korean man blank his way out of doing military service. South Korean man blank his way out of doing military service. And the second question, which is linked to that, is why didn't I do this yesterday? I suspect you'll be able to work that out, if indeed you were listening yesterday. If you weren't, you know how it works. I need a letter off your mum by the end of break today. Who can ring in onto that? Well, everyone can, technically. Theoretically, anyone can. But who is actually qualified to contribute to a conversation about the floods that have once again blighted swathes of the United Kingdom? A major incident declared at an aquadrome in Northamptonshire where people were rescued from flooded homes and stranded vehicles. Huge disruption on the rail network in parts of southern England and Wales, with lines blocked by floodwater, fallen trees, debris everywhere. Fire crews rescued 57 children from a school bus after it became stuck in floodwater in Worcestershire. River Severn's always been something of an early adopter of these kinds of issues. There's a beautiful little town called Bewdley, which I grew up very, very near, and would routinely, the riverside buildings would routinely disappear underwater. And the last time I was there, actually, decades late, but loads and loads and loads of work being done on the flood defences. So, things can be done. I remember, I've told you a few times as well, haven't I, that the film that Al Gore made many moons ago now featured a very Republican, and I mean that in a nice way, not in a post-Donald Trump kind of way, but a very Republican mayor of a town that was susceptible to flooding. And he explained more clearly than I can remember anyone else ever doing the absolutely commercial imperative of spending money on flood defences, because to wait until the disaster happens and then fixing it is going to cost you a hell of a lot more over a period of time during which flooding is likely to get more frequent than it would do to prevent it in the first place. So it's one of those classic examples of the relationship between expenditure and return, isn't it? Short-term expense, long-term saving. Who else thinks of gully suckers at this point? No? All right, just me. But they're relevant to flooding as well, of course, because if you don't use the gully suckers, the machines that used to keep the gutters clean, then flooding is more likely to happen because you're more likely to get blockages. South Korean man bought his way out of military service, says Mark. Tweeted, says Jack. It's all about blue sky now, Jack. How many times? A couple of you have got it right, but I'm not going to give you the answer just yet because it's such a corker of a question. And, of course, the side order of why we didn't actually insert it into yesterday's programme, despite the fact that we intended to, may also raise a smile. 7 minutes after 10 is the time. So, I mean, everyone's an expert on something, aren't they? Or everyone's an expert, it sometimes seems, when you do this for a living. The subjects on which everybody has a view. Some extraordinary misinformation about wind turbines floating around the ether just a few minutes ago. There's people who think they're experts who turn out to know nothing. Subjects on which everyone's an expert include things like stop and search legislation or immigration. Everyone's got a view. Everyone's got an opinion. Everyone thinks their opinion is absolutely urgent. But on this is really important. And who are the experts? Who could tell me today whether or not it's fair to blame forecasters, environment officials and politicians for the paucity or lack of warnings issued before, I think, the rather unhelpfully named Storm Bert? You don't really want to start thinking about Sesame Street, do you, when there's a massive storm coming up your garden path? But how fair is it to blame forecasters, environmental officials and politicians over the lack of warnings issued before Storm Bert arrived? I think you can blame them you can't blame the current government for the paucity of flood defences, can you? Because they haven't been in charge for anything like long enough to have introduced better flood defences. But you probably, and I imagine that the quangos responsible for dealing with some of these issues have been financially filleted by 14 years of Tory rule. I don't know, though, because who is qualified to comment on this? Isn't that weird? Isn't that weird that of all the subjects that we can discuss together, the one that might actually involve your own home being swept away in floodwater is the one upon which nobody's really got much insight or opinion to share? Well, I say nobody. It'd be a bit of a disaster if that's true, because this will be one of the shortest phone-ins. In fact, you couldn't even technically call it a phone-in, could you, if no one actually phoned in? But how fair is it? How do we know? He didn't flirt his way out of military service, Hannah, no, although that would be quite interesting. I begin with that question. The only severe flood warning in England and Wales remained in place at Billing Aquadrome, but all over the country, or in several parts of the country, people were suffering in appalling ways. A chap in Wales said, my neighbour phoned and said, don't open your front door. So I didn't, and we just watched it come up. I really don't think we're going to get this cleared up by Christmas. And there it is. There is the perfect example of what I'm trying to convey. Because if you're sitting in your home and catastrophic flooding is on the way, I appreciate the water can fall out of the sky quite quickly, but it doesn't come down as a fait accompli, does it? This is my brief foray into meteorology. It's not like it lands in a nanosecond and you suddenly go from 0 to 60 in the blink of an eye. You know, if you are monitoring such things, or at least I presume you know, if you are monitoring such things, that the direction of traffic is deeply dangerous, that things are about to get very, very hairy. And yet, South Wales in particular reports that no lessons have been learned. Indeed, The Guardian goes with the headline, history repeats itself. It wasn't the water that was coming from the river and coming up the street. It's coming out of the drainage system and then also the back of the building. So once again, we turn our attention to the water companies. So that's question number one, which is how bad is our system? So if this has happened to you, either this year or another time, what warnings did you get? And talk to me about how it feels to get no warnings at all. I can't quite believe that you get a phone call off your neighbour shortly before the entire ground floor of your home disappears underwater. It feels to me, and remember that when the usual weirdos start talking about small state and small government, this is the kind of thing they're talking about. The kind of thing that Elon Musk is currently charged with in America, is getting rid of things that help ordinary people that very, very rich people don't think they need or should be paying for. So the idea that there's nothing there to warn you that your home is about to disappear underwater and that not enough has been done to protect your home from the danger of disappearing underwater intrigues me on every level. It intrigues me on the personal level because you automatically imagine yourself in a similar situation, and it intrigues me on the political level, but also on the philosophical level, on the question of whether or not it is fair to actually criticise or condemn the authorities, in this case the Met Office, and that's why I mentioned the metaphorical ghost of Michael Fish, who for younger listeners once scoffed at a lady who had contacted the BBC with concerns about reports that a hurricane was crossing the Atlantic and about to arrive on these islands, and he scoffed at her shortly before a hurricane crossed the Atlantic and arrived on these islands. So there's always the question of how accurate these predictions can be, but I'd rather get the warning and then find out I didn't need it than not get the warning at all. So I don't know who can answer that. Genuine question. Who is actually qualified to comment on how good a job the authorities are doing? 0345 6060 973. And then you have the question of what happens. This is the personal made public, the personal made political. We look at these pictures. We see a fella who's up to his knees in mud. We see a petrol station forecourt that is largely underwater. We see photographs of a craft shop in Tenbury Wells in Worcestershire, another town I know quite well, that have had to essentially strip out the entire ground floor. We read about thousands and thousands of pounds worth of damage being done. And there's also a terrible story about a tractor driving down one street, again in Tenbury Wells, and creating a sort of a wave that ended up smashing windows and making damage much worse, because you can protect against this sort of thing. One of my local pubs is routinely flooded, and they are now so well protected, or rather the towpath outside the pub is routinely flooded, and they're now so well protected that when the tide is high on the River Thames, you can canoe past the window of the snug. The window is so tightly fitted now, and the infrastructure has been so enforced that you can literally be sitting in the snug enjoying a pint of, I don't know, perhaps Oliver's Island, and there it goes. A canoe just floats past the window. So there is stuff you can do, and there's clearly stuff we haven't done. So the public, as in what could the authorities have done better, and then the personal. This interests me forever, and it always will. What happens if you get hit, if your life gets disrupted by this sort of thing? What actually happens? Where do you sleep tonight if your home is uninhabitable? Where do you go? I mean, the insurers kick in, but eventually, presumably, there comes a point where the insurers are advising you to change. What does the country do, both to warn about or prevent this kind of thing, and then afterwards to deal with the aftermath? Okay? And there's so much going on. It's such a story of extremes. You're either not involved in it at all, or you're up to your eyeballs in mud. So in Blaenau Gwent, again in Wales, people evacuated after a landslip from a coal tip left a trail of destruction, buildings deep in sludge, mud and water pouring down Woodland Terrace. It was a washout of a former coal tip in the area. So again, could the government have done more to stop that? And, I mean, Valencia. One thinks of Spain and the images there. And that leads us to the final question, which again, people will know a lot about, but they won't be getting hard. People who've done the Just Stop Oil training, people who have been awoken to the urgency of the climate crisis. Again, you have to, unfortunately, recall that across the Atlantic, the new administration preparing to take power describes all of this science, all of this observable evidence as a hoax. So that's the final question. Is this the new normal? Environmentally speaking, for all the noise and faffing, the bottom line is that this could now be normal. This could now be increasingly recurring. Not so much Groundhog Day as Groundhog Week or Groundhog Month. On it goes. So a variety of questions about flooding, all or any of which you are invited to answer. I don't know enough about the science to know how fair it is to criticise the authorities, but I know that they are being criticised, forecasters, environmental officials and politicians. So draw upon your expertise. I'm thinking people who don't ordinarily ring into radio phone-in programmes may be feeling their ears prick up at the prospect of bringing some knowledge and expertise that you know is not widespread or commonplace to bear on the programme this morning. Then you've got the question of what actually happens. The clear-up that is underway across swathes of Wales and England in particular, hundreds of properties flooded, a Welsh mining town hit by a landslip, buildings deep in sludge and mud. Still more than 100 flood warnings active in Wales and England last night, but so far only one major incident declared. So what happens when it happens to you? 0345 606 0973. And if you've got the science, can you confirm or deny my suspicion, is that the right word? Fear? That this is going to become considerably more commonplace. You know, parts of Florida where it is, the build is now designed to withstand the floods that 50 years ago barely happened at all. 0345 606 0973. And thank you for correcting my Welsh pronunciations. I knew that I'd be getting it wrong, but it's not exactly the most important element of the conversation at this stage. Question number 1. Should they have done a better job in predicting, forecasting, warning, and indeed coping with the increasingly common extreme weather? Question number 2, what happens when you're hit by it? And question number 3, that phrase there, increasingly common extreme weather. That's another don't look up moment, isn't it? I wonder where the water would have to get to. Imagine you're sitting watching the telly, sitting on your sofa, and you are someone who doesn't believe in climate change. It's all a hoax. You're a Donald Trump fan. You're sitting on your sofa and the water's at your ankles, and then it's at your knees. One of my godsons used to sing a song, which I always remember contained the line. It was about flooding, and it contained the line, "Ooh, eck, it's up to me neck." And I was so at what point do you think, do you know what, maybe this stuff is real? Maybe this stuff does actually demand our attention. 0345 6060 973.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 20 minutes after 10. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I just don't know that this is true, Elias. You simply can't predict this kind of weather, especially in places like Corby. I've got an idiot's corner, nice and early this morning. I'll tell you one thing, you lefty moron, writes SD. People whose houses are flooded couldn't be put in hotels because they are full of illegal immigrants. That's quite the take. I believe he starts work as a Daily Mail columnist tomorrow. And John's very cross. It was not a hurricane back in 1987. Why must you lie in order to make your point? False facts as ever. Calm down, Karen. The Great Storm of 1987 was a violent extratropical cyclone. My apologies. It was hurricane force winds causing casualties in the United Kingdom, France and the Channel Islands. So the question of how increasingly common this kind of event is going to become is sadly one that is still debated, even though the evidence is that it is increasing. The thing that is, if you like, more of a grey area, the thing that we don't know the answer to is whether or not enough is being done. What would happen if Rachel Reeves announced tomorrow that she was going to increase taxes in order to make huge swathes of England and Wales flood-proof? How do you think the right-wing media would respond? Well, exactly. Maybe that's why the net zero scepticism exists, so that people with all the money are not required to give some of it to the country to keep everybody else afloat, or rather dry. I don't know. 21 after 10 is the time. I think we'll wait for Sally, shall we? Because we want to start with someone who's actually been flooded, and then we'll move into some of the more academic areas of inquiry that are going to be thrown up by this conversation. But that's the key question. What is it like when it happens to you? And Sally is in Gosport. Sally, what can you tell us?
Well, on the night of the 8th of April, we were completely flooded out. We lived near the end of a part of Portsmouth Harbour. Now, they knew that there was going to be a high tide. They knew it was at the end of one of the big storms. We had a warning the night before by text.
How they text you, so they know where you live and you're on a database somewhere and you get text? Because I think most of us are completely ignorant of this stuff, Sally. And what do you do in response to the warning?
Well, the warning didn't include our village.
Right. Oh.
So the warning that came out was very vague. Nobody brought out sandbags or anything. And what happened was, it was the middle of the night. My husband heard the dog barking, went downstairs, gets three steps up from the hall, and is in water. And it was tidal. So it had swept through the house. It was such a force that it knocked over 2 big fridge freezers, went down the garden and knocked over another one in the shed, then departed again a couple of hours later, leaving behind a trail of destruction, plaster up to about 20 inches of water, so all our furniture went.
I think it's hard to understand the scale of that impact, isn't it? Because you know it's filthy water as well. It's not as if it's just a leaking tap and everything will dry out again. There's filth involved.
Well, it's mud.
Yeah.
We were lucky in that they do discharge sewage, of course, like all of them. But the guy that came round and tested it said it's just sand and mud. It's not. There's no sewage in there.
Well, that's a relief.
But of course, everything is sopping wet. You've got sopping wet carpets. Everything is wet. The saving grace was, if there is one, was that our boiler was upstairs. So we still had hot water, but the whole house was just soaking wet.
And what are your options in terms of insurance and things like that? Can you go to a hotel? Can you? I mean, I'm presuming, of course, that they're not all full of capital letters illegal immigrants, close capital letters. But what does the insurer do in this context?
Well, depending. Some of the insurers were much better than others.
Interesting.
Some, they're not all brilliant. I mean, I tell you, it happened in April. Our house is still not being done. Oh. So we're in a tenancy, which we have been since July.
Right.
But
you mean you've moved out?
Yeah, we had to move out because it was sopping wet downstairs.
So into furnished accommodation?
unfurnished.
Unfurnished.
I mean, that's a bit of a problem, but we went to a charity shop and got old settees and things, so we're in a tenancy. The thing that killed me was there's nobody to help you, nobody to advise you on what to do.
This is what I'm asking about. Yes.
And even age concerns said, oh no. I mean, my neighbours and I were talking, because we were all affected, there were 50 of us affected, all our cars as well went. And it just makes you angry because this was preventable.
Well, how confident are we that it was preventable? And I'll just pick up on that point for people listening who aren't concentrating properly. But your car has gone as well. Your home is uninhabitable. Your entire life has been turned completely upside down.
Yeah.
Incredible. Although Andy's struck by the fact that you had 3 fridge freezers. I don't know why he's focusing upon that point, but he is intrigued by...
Okay. The reason I mentioned that was the force of it was
I understand. To turn it over,
much.
to hit it. So every aspect of your life is in complete disarray, and there's no light at the end of the tunnel.
Not at the moment. I mean, they're telling us March. Well, that's nearly a year. But and
just hang on to take you back to the confidence that it could have been prevented. Where does that come from?
It comes from the fact that they were building a defence. They started to build it. They started to build a barrier along the top of this part of the harbour that comes near us.
Right.
They discovered a cable running underneath the road and decided it was too expensive to continue.
There it is.
So they shelved it, but they did have the money to go and buy an old cinema as a kind of, I don't know what for. They had the money for that, but they don't have enough money to do the obvious to help their citizens. And it makes me very angry.
I mean, I don't know that the money that they raised to buy the cinema would have met much of the cost of the kind of flood defences that you're talking about. But I understand why you see the two things in a similar space.
Well, yeah, because it was actually quite a narrow road. They didn't have very much to do. It wasn't as if it was all the way along.
Well, this is the bit we don't get, isn't it? And I guess it's because they are, rare occurrences or acts of God, to use the insurance parlance. They don't take the measures. But that central point you made about a complete absence of reference points of assistance. So all we've got there in the context of what you expect society to do. Sally, take care. I'm sorry you're in such a strong position to contribute to this conversation. This is why I find it fascinating, though, with the luxury of not being flooded. The question of what society is for, what government is for, and the deep fear I have about the direction of traffic towards small statism, people trying to persuade people who need a big state that they don't want a big state. And all of politics in the last few years has been about persuading people to vote or to act against their own interests. So this is precisely what is spoken about, a perfect example of what government does if it's big enough, and that involves being paid for. And there's nothing. You get a text message that isn't really relevant to you, and the next thing you know, your husband's downstairs, up to his knees, his pyjamas are soaking wet, he's up to his knees in water, and the fridge freezers are floating out the back door. Ross is in Battersea. Ross, what would you like to say?
Morning, James. Hope you're doing well.
Carry on.
Yes, so I think with climate change coming down the road, we're going to see every area of our lives become a lot more unpredictable. Floods are going to become a regular occurrence. And I'm not a scientist, but I work in the finance department for a major food supplier. And it
says on my screen that, I don't know why Joe has put this on the screen, but it did make me smile. It says here that you work in finance in the cheese sector.
Yes.
Are you a big cheese? Are you a big cheese, Ross? I
wish I was, but I'm just a small cog in a big machine.
Go on. So, I mean, that's agriculture, that's commerce, that's all sorts of issues relevant to the central conversation that we're having.
Yes, so we're seeing all over the world food prices and food sustainability and continuance is just spiking and collapsing. Prices of every aspect of our lives are going up massively, and people don't realise it. They like to say supermarkets and food producers, they're just ripping us all off because they're all greedy capitalists, but they don't see the behind-the-scenes price rises. If you look at this place called El Edo in Spain, they produce a huge amount of tomatoes and peppers.
Right.
They had a hailstorm that destroyed their crops. They lost about 4,500 hectares. When you look at this place, it's literally a village that is white on the map. If you look at Google Images, Google Maps satellite view, and that's greenhouses. And obviously greenhouses don't like hailstorms.
No.
So things like that are happening regularly.
And you've got people. So
times.
Donald Trump says drill, baby, drill, and people on both sides of the Atlantic are sort of, they've somehow persuaded themselves this is good news for them. Ha-ha! Fossil fuels. And yet everything, as you describe it, is linked. You know, the cost of the shopping is going to go up as a consequence of the impact on farming. That sort of inability that people have so far displayed to join the dots that you are joining in their own minds, or the media failing to join the dots, is absolutely incredible, isn't it? I mean, it's like kind of medieval, believing that something's going to fall out of the sky, or just denying the evidence of heliocentrism. It's just like there's this mass delusion that the problem is nowhere near as big or as real as their own eyes are telling them it is.
Yeah, and it's a mix of two things. It's the average person obviously doesn't want to make massive changes to their lives. I get it.
Yeah.
I don't want to eat, change my lifestyle, change my diet to save something that I don't see immediately in front of me.
Yeah.
But the people in charge of these things, like the Donald Trumps, the Farages, the Moggs, they can afford not to care. You know, if you look at the food chain, places like Asda, Tesco, they are on the lower end. They get the worst crops, and we're going to see the quality of the produce in vitamins, the size, the price change radically over the next 10, 15 years. But people that can afford to spend M&S, Waitrose, they're not going to see a massive price because they can afford to buy the better stuff.
I'd never thought of it like that. I mean, it leaves the psychological question of whether the kind of characters that you mention are consciously lying and consciously misleading, or whether they're just particularly extreme examples of that refusal to accept the need to change, and that stubbornness then becomes almost attractive politically. It's if you are someone who doesn't want to change, and I think we've all, as Ross acknowledges, got something like that impulse inside us, and the politician who comes along and says, don't worry, you don't need to change, even if he's lying through his teeth, becomes attractive because it appeals to your unwillingness to change. Thank you, Ross. Oh, you're big cheese on this programme, mate. It is, although not the biggest, it is 10:32. Phone lines are open. What happens when it happens to you? 0345 6060 973. What should we be doing? There's a question. There must be people qualified to answer it. What should we be doing to prevent these kind of events from happening? Because I think that the third question is rhetorical. Is this, and I don't like the phrase the new normal, but sometimes it's the only one that fits. Is this the new normal? Hit the numbers now, you will get through. 0345 6060 973. Thomas Watts has your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
35 is the time. A little bit of love can go a long way. Satish has been in touch to say that big cheese gag was really funny, James. I couldn't help laughing out loud. Keep it up. I'll do my best, Satish. And Dave was struck by that call as well, because his next delivery is actually taking place in a town called Cheese. I'm always happy to keep people company when they are on the road. Quite a few people with specific experiences of this, but I might nudge you towards the psychology shortly. Gregory and Tony up next. A couple of texts before that. Hi, James, writes Tom. We live in rural southwest Wales. Over the past few years, have been impacted by flash flooding on several occasions. Our local council has installed 2 major new drains to deal with surface water running off the surrounding farmland. It's becoming an increasingly frequent occurrence. The way we farm our land in Wales, particularly pasture, is part of the problem. The water just pours off the fields. Trees are great at helping to slow down flooding, and we need more tree planting to mitigate climate change. It's something, again, I know I've bigged him up rather a lot recently, but James Rebanks, the hill farmer and author, huge on sustainability. Goes right, in fact, his new book is a consequence of visits he made to far-flung corners of the planet to look at sustainability projects internationally, because these sort of issues are part of the almost like a honeycomb, a network of interrelated issues that don't always appear to be linked to people like us on the outside looking in. And of course, if you're not on the outside looking in, if you're on the inside and you can help the rest of us come to a better understanding of some of these issues, then you know what to do. 10:37 is the time. Gregory's in Weybridge. Gregory, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James. What I'd like to say is everybody that uses the water systems, be they sewage or that, is actually, in her own way, contributing to the problem. I'm literally parked up now, and I'm looking, and the paving of people's front gardens is a small contributory factor. Because when I was a kid, we used to grow flowers.
And it runs off into surface water, which the last take. You know, here's an interesting thing, before you continue, which I promise you will be doing. I think that 5 years ago, if you'd phoned in and said that when we were having a conversation about flooding, I think I'd have rolled my eyes. I'd have just gone, here we go, it's all about patios. And yet...
Not finished yet.
Well, it's just true, isn't it? You've got it's things we have to guard against, like the rolling of the eyes or the poo-pooing of explanations because they sound implausible or because you've heard them before. It's really important that more people know paving over their front gardens is a really bad idea.
Next point,
yes,
what we put into our sewage system.
All right, be careful.
The amount of fat that ends up in there and the amount of wipes, be they facial wipes or be they baby wipes, you would not believe. I worked in a place in Surrey, and before skips of that sort of waste coming out as opposed to it, and that's all got to be separated from the fertiliser stuff. But
if the amount of water in the system is not increasing exponentially, then these issues become less urgent. These are contributory factors, but they're tributaries of the main river, and the main river is just the volume of water increasing all the time.
That is true, but what also happens then is the system was built for a certain level. It was built, I think it's for 18 million people for London, and now it's 9 million. It wasn't designed for that, and it certainly wasn't designed for wipes. It certainly wasn't designed for fat.
We're not really talking today, and I appreciate the issue is a live one, about that side of things. We're talking about rivers bursting their banks. We're talking about coal pits causing landslides. We're talking about the stuff coming out of the sky, Gregory, not the stuff coming out of people's...
contributes to it.
No, it contributes to in urban environments, but most of these stories that we're discussing today are very much about rural environments or indeed towns like Tenbury Wells in Worcestershire, which does not have an overrun or an outdated sewage system. It's just had an absolute torrent of waterfall on it in a relatively small period of time. 20 to 11 is the time. Thank you, Gregory. And it is true. There's the little things that everyone can do, and you sort of think to yourself, well, why should I bother? And then someone shares some nonsense about China as a reason why you might as well pave over your front garden or stop doing your recycling. It's the psychology that fascinates me. We touched on this when Valencia was flooded on an extraordinary scale, on an apocalyptic scale. Probably a more helpful word than biblical. And in the space of an hour, we went from wondering whether or not this would be a wake-up call for people to realising that it wouldn't. So at risk of overburdening you, if you were hit by this stuff, why doesn't it immediately turn you into an environmental activist? Why doesn't everybody whose home has been flooded join Just Stop Oil and start chaining themselves across roads like the next day? Where does that disconnect come from? And it's going to be linked to politics. Apropos nothing in particular, Nigel Farage's Reform Party has accepted £2.3 million from fossil fuel interests, climate deniers and polluters since the 2019 election. So, one of the finest exponents of persuading people to believe things that aren't true in order to get them to do things that are bad for them, right at the forefront of this kind of issue. 10:41 is the time. Tony's in Taunton. Tony, what would you like to say?
James, you were quite correct when you were saying, is this something that's going to happen on a more regular basis? Yes, it is. Yeah. It's going to be the new normal, I'm afraid. There is no question about it. And several of these points that other people have made are quite correct. It's not just about climate change. It's about decisions people are making about where to build houses, how they're going to do stuff, paving over their front gardens, etc. The real problem, and you raised this just a few minutes ago, is about health. A lot of people in these areas, they're going to be exposed to diseases such as hepatitis. Their mental health is going to be shot. And we literally have no strategy whatsoever for dealing with these things other than people saying, leave it to the local GP to
and black mold. Even when you move back in again, the prevalence of mold, and I think that's still very nascent science in understanding that the health impacts that mold can have on human beings. What's your interest? What's your connection to this issue?
I was involved in the flooding in Somerset back in 2014. And
when you say you were involved, Tony, you don't mean you caused it.
No. No, I went down and helped out the people that were flooded. There's three phases. There's the response, where you get in there, you try and get people out, you try and protect their homes by putting barriers up to stop the water getting in, these kind of things. Then subsequently, you've got the recovery phase, where you try and get things out, try and redecorate, dry the places out, whatever you've got to do. And then finally, you put it in resilience, where you put in things to stop the water from going that direction, go in a different direction, etc. The problem is we don't do any of those particularly well.
And none of it's centralised, as far as I can tell. A lot of people are going to be making their own individual, like the pub that I go to in Chiswick. That I presume that has done it all off its own back, because it's particularly exposed to flooding. But the idea that society should be stepping in when entire towns are at risk doesn't seem to me to be too pie in the sky.
It doesn't happen. It literally. I was speaking to the CEO of the local authority, and they do actually have a disaster recovery plan. And he said it's in everybody's desk drawer, and he said he doesn't think anybody's ever read it. It is literally like that situation.
I wonder what it'll take. This is why the Valencia conversation was so interesting. To sort of, I mean, maybe it won't. That's why the film, I don't know if you saw that Leonardo DiCaprio film a couple of Christmases ago, about which posits a meteor heading towards Earth as a metaphor for climate change, and the idea is if you don't look up, then you won't worry about it. And the floodwater feels similar to me. It's as if you can ignore it because it doesn't come around very often, or you can ignore it when it's only round your ankles. Someone has suggested if the Thames barrier starts overtopping on a regular basis, then the political will might be enhanced in some way. But for ordinary people, you would think, wouldn't you, when you see footage of entire towns looking like Welsh towns, looking like Venice, accidental Venices, that people would sit up and take more notice. And what you remind us of is that even when the response is in place, it's going to rely still a lot on volunteers and things rather than on society.
Mm. You may think I'm being cynical, but I can tell you now, most of the people that were flooded out in Somerset, not one of them has changed their way of life. None of them have changed stop oil or any. And it is simply a matter of people close their minds to it, and it's like, okay, it's happened once, it won't happen again. But
here's a nice.
Will happen.
I like this from Des. He writes, "It's a wake-up alarm clock or a wake-up alarm that we're sleeping through."
Yeah,
I mean it. I don't know whether I'd be any better, Tony. I'm not going to sit here and be all holier than thou. If my house had been flooded last year, I probably would have spent a few quid on sandbags, or asked around about whether or not there was anything I could do. Would I really have joined Just Stop Oil? Would I have become a tireless campaigner against climate change? I honestly don't know. Sometimes we're just too busy. It's not a mark of Cain, is it? It's not a sign of being a psychopath or being nasty. It's just, I've got enough to deal with. I can't be looking after the planet as well as the kids. And I mean that sincerely. 10:46 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I'm going to trust Nigel's statistics on this one, not that one. 2007 floods gave rise to a report that governments were to enact. Come 2014, David Cameron blamed Labour, then didn't enact all the parts that he promised he would. Matt Hancock tried to convince us that it would be done. Nigel writes that he was in charge of emergency planning at the time, so he knows of what he speaks. Where's the political payoff in this? You announce now that you're going to spend billions on flood defences. Whose vote do you win? I mean, it could be that cynical. 10:46 is the time.
James O'Brien on LBC.
10:49, some breaking news for you. The world's oldest living man has died. I don't know why they put the word living in that sentence. I suppose, he may not have been the oldest ever to have lived. Has died at the age of 112. From Liverpool, John Alfred Tinniswood. I saw an interview with him once. He seemed like a really lovely man. And he became the oldest living man in the world in April of this year. I've said it before and I'll say it again. That title is a kiss of death. Seriously. There are a number of times that I've reported on this programme that someone who had achieved the status of being the oldest living man in the world has then subsequently passed away. It's like a curse. It really is. He was born in the year that the Titanic sank. And do you know what Keith pointed out? He had to explain this to me a couple of times. And on this occasion, that was my fault, not his. But Keith pointed out that if you become the oldest living person in the world, then think about this for a minute. When you're born, for a few seconds, you're the youngest person in the world, right? Maybe it's only nanoseconds. Don't at me. So when you're born, you're the youngest person in the world. We all are, for a blink of an eye. But if you actually become, and I know this guy's only the oldest living man, but stay with me, or Keith. When you become the oldest living person in the world, every single person who was alive when you were born is dead. So there's not a single person on the planet except you who was there when you were born. It's like, I think we're talking about water and flooding. It's like you're flushing a central heating system and there's not a single drop of water in the central heating system afterwards than there is at the beginning. Now, some people listening to that are like, what are they on about now? And other people are doing what me and Keith did, which is to go, whoa, okay, yeah, wow, that's mad. And again, other people are going, yeah, all right, whatever. But I think that's interesting. 10:51 is the time. Something else interesting. I'll give you the answer to this, to the first missing word round of the day. Here was the mystery. South Korean man blank his way out of doing military service. And this is one of the ones where I think you might have actually guessed correctly. Because once you start thinking what word, and it's a single word, could fit into that space, you could stumble across the right answer. It's a brilliant headline. South Korean man ate his way out of doing military service. A South Korean man has been convicted of evading compulsory military service by eating so much he became too obese to fight. A court in Seoul sentenced the 26-year-old, who has not been named, to a year in prison, suspended for 2 years. A friend was convicted of abetting the man after providing a high-calorie meal plan. The friend, also 26, received a 6-month suspended sentence, according to the South Korean daily Jungang Ilbo. What a great tale, honestly. I wonder how he got caught. How would he get caught? Is it a Columbo type scenario? Just one more thing. How would you get caught? You piled on the weight. Maybe they'd find your WhatsApp messages or something like that. But anyway, the missing word was 8. And some of you did guess it correctly, I think. And some of you almost certainly cheated. Back to flooding. Chris is in Durham. Chris, what made you pick up the phone?
Good morning.
Hello.
I've got a view as a resilient professional for 30 years around what your previous caller said and what you've discussed on the societal response to these types of incidents.
What sort of resilient worker were you, if you don't mind me asking?
I'm a former Chief Fire Officer.
There we
I
go.
was the Chair of the National Fire Chiefs Council Operations Committee, and I'm currently Associate Lecturer for the College of Police.
Fantastic. Thank you. You're very well qualified. What do you think's going on?
Well, so under the Civil Contingencies Act, which was amended in 2024, all Category 1 responders, which is the government agencies such as police, fire, ambulance, local authority, army, and others, have a legal responsibility to come together for response, recovery, and resilience.
Right.
Now, the response phase, in my personal opinion, is exercised and conducted really well.
Okay.
Track record of that. What is not at all efficiently exercised is the recovery phase. So my view is that everywhere in our country today, everybody is now in the recovery phase.
Yes.
The response phase lasts a very short period of time. We're now in recovery, and because it's not exercised, people do not know how to best serve their communities. I recently did it's called a MAGIC course. It's Multi-Agency Gold Incident Command course, where I was lecturing somewhere in the country. I asked everybody in the room, when was the last time you exercised your response to a major flood? Everybody put their hands up.
Yeah.
I asked, when was the last time you exercised recovery from a major flood? Nobody put their hands up. Nobody had ever done it. I think it's a huge change in mindset that the CCA, the Civil Contingencies Act, does not focus on.
This is fascinating. And I mean, my simple layman's response would be that recovery is not an emergency and response is.
Well, no, there's a life cycle. You've got emergency response, you've got recovery, and you've got preparation.
Yeah.
Now, the first thing anybody needs to be doing is get the plan. Something happens, get the plan. But you need to know the plan, and you need to exercise the plan, and that does not happen in our country.
And the point I was making is simply the idea that when you put out fires as a firefighter, you didn't have to redecorate the house. Do you see what I mean? You didn't.
Yes.
You didn't.
Yes.
So our emergency services are not attuned towards the concept of recovery in the way that they are attuned towards the concept of reaction, of emergency response.
This is absolutely true. So you'll get a major incident. You'll get a major incident. Fire, police, ambulance will turn up. We'll do what we do. Then we'll hand it up to the local authority, who are neither resourced or competent in terms of exercising in delivering it. So my view, it needs to be a whole stakeholder response. And by stakeholder, I mean everybody who's listed as a Category 1 responder in the Civil Contingencies Act. And that just doesn't happen. We don't focus on the recovery enough. Littlehampton in April flooded. It'll flood again, and there's still people out of the houses because we can't do recovery in a really, really good way. Now, there is a good news. This can change. We just need to change the focus. And yes, we do need to focus on response, because that's the point of it. But everything that leads away from that prevents further or mitigates further.
Of course it does. And you, I think this feeds into my political hobby horse, which is that it's about the role that society or government plays, whether it's local or national government. This is very much part of their remit, and yet as it stands, you've got political voices that would claim that it isn't, and you've got an absence of investment, a lack of political capital to be made from doing it. But it's what a civilized, functioning society should be doing as a matter of course.
I totally agree, but I do also, if I could propose that there is another element of that.
Go on.
That's also personal responsibility. I don't think the two things are counterintuitive.
No, you're quite right.
I've been to floods where people have been stood in the ground floor of the house with water 3 feet high, destroying their television, their furniture and everything, and they just didn't bother to lift it up to the next floor. There's an element of personal responsibility as well as...
I don't know where to go with that. It's just presumably they're dazed, aren't they? They're just a bit shocked by things.
No, they're lazy.
Come on, they're just standing there going, I'm going to watch my telly disappear, float off, because I can't be bothered. I can't be fagged to pick it up and take it upstairs.
No, James, what they said is, what are you going to do about this?
Oh, okay, yeah, they're turning up and thinking it's your job to do it. So yeah, there's a definite... Wow, I mean, I don't know whether or not you're aware that I reserve an award for callers whose qualifications to contribute to a conversation that we are having are above and beyond the call of duty, Chris. But I'm so if you're not aware of it, you won't have the first idea about what's about to happen next. But if you are aware of it, I hope you will feel suitably honoured.
You made me, dear.
I'm Ray Liotta, and you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. If you build it, they will come.
They will. Thank you for coming, Chris. You'll be more than welcome back. And I have to find this. If I can find it in time, it's going to seem like we almost know what we're doing on this programme. And here it is. This is from Steve. James, in Rayleigh, in Essex, the fire brigade pumped out a huge flood in the weir to clear the road, but pumped it into inadequate drainage ditches that flooded many homes. Instead of pumping the water out of people's homes, they were pumping it into them. And the Highways Department said they will do it again if they have to. And that is Rayleigh, where you've got to worry about the otters. Are you with? Is anyone with me on that? Yeah, that's incredible. Right? No, never mind. I don't know why I bother. Kevin's in Southwark. I haven't got long, Kevin, but I want to squeeze you in. What would you like to say?
Yeah, just quickly. 20 years ago, I worked for the OECD. For your listeners, that's basically the rich countries of the world.
Yes.
And I wrote, and I quote, this is what I wrote: the incidence and severity of floods have been increasing over recent decades.
Yes.
And so back then, 20 years ago, DEFRA, the UK Ministry of Agriculture, as it was, wrote an initiative called Making Space for Water. So, in other words, using agriculture to slow up water coming down the catchment. And sadly, that investment and those projects, there have been some in the UK, but have not been put in place.
Nowhere near enough.
Climate change isn't taken seriously enough.
Yeah, well, I mean, leaving aside the net zero weirdos claiming that none of it's real or that the science is non-existent or the evidence isn't there, for what you might loosely describe as responsible politicians who haven't done enough, presumably because the rewards aren't clear in terms of electoral capital.
Well, I think you're right. I think one of the problems with flood prevention, say in the UK, is the focus has been right down in the rivers in town, straightening them out, huge projects, concrete, as I call them, hard projects. So concrete walls, people can see things. If you go up into the water catchment where the farming land is, you could pay farmers to flood their fields, put in hedges and to slow up the water flow coming down the valley. But sadly, that's not done.
No, so you need. I mean, this is what you hopefully do in early terms of government, albeit that some people will start petitions demanding that you have another general election a few weeks after losing the last one. That's what you have to do. It's one of the reasons I was quite optimistic about Starmer. The idea that there's stuff he has to do that is not necessarily popular or will not be immediately translatable into votes, such is the state of Brexit Britain, that when he does things that are briefly unpopular or temporarily unpopular in the hope of permanent improvement, some people clutch their pearls so tightly that they could do themselves a mischief. Thank you, Kevin. It is just gone 11 o'clock.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 4 minutes after 11, and for those of you whose sense of humour is pitifully similar to mine, Ray Liotta was actually in a film called Dangerous Waters. And, of course, otters build dams. So someone who got up a little bit earlier than me could have knitted all of that together. If we'd known that Chris's call was coming in, we could have knitted all of that together to assemble something beautiful. But it's too late now. I've got another missing word. This is a good one. I'll give you a clue on this one. The Johnson refers to who you think it refers to. Okay. Johnson blames blank for Britain's obesity crisis. Boris Johnson blames blank for Britain's obesity crisis. Who do you think Boris Johnson is blaming for Britain's obesity crisis? Get your answers coming in now. I'm still getting some fascinating responses to that conversation about the flooding and the climate change. But we will move on. I may read a couple of them out in the course of this hour. But I want to move on because I'm obsessed with this, and I don't know why. But you do know that I was right to be obsessed with it in the sense of the political landscape. Front pages today, Labour makes pledge to ensure no young person is left behind. In fact, how the media works is interesting. There is no crackdown. So all of yesterday's front pages were about imminent crackdowns on young people. And indeed, we covered our conversation. We held our conversation in a way that reflected the idea that hard rain was coming for young people. And actually, the details that are going to be released by the Labour government later today will not involve actual punishment. There may be consequences, but there will not be punishment, which, of course, leads some people in the right-wing media to complain that they're not going to be mean enough to young people who aren't in work. But there is an element, quite a big element of this story that we haven't explored properly. Johnson blames Gary Lineker for obesity crisis. Meghan and Harry, these are all very valid answers. Kim says Starmer. Jeremy Corbyn comes from Jay. Brexit, unlikely, Gareth, but amusing. And even more unlikely, in fact, the most unlikely answer of all comes in from Lizzie. Johnson blames himself for Britain's obesity crisis. Johnson blames himself. 3 words that you will never see in the wild in this country ever. 6 minutes after 11. The BBC's done good work on this, and they have succeeded where until yesterday we had failed. And they have, as a consequence of that, unearthed something that we perhaps have. No, Johnson blames James O'Brien, not this time, Martin. Something that we had struggled with a bit. So if you haven't been paying attention lately, or if you don't tune in regularly, or if you've never listened before, I'm obsessed with the cohort of young people who are not in work or training or education. And by obsessed, I mean concerned for, deeply concerned for. And part of the reason for that concern is my deep knowledge of what lazy journalism does to people like that. It denigrates them, it attacks them, it misrepresents them, it undermines them, it paints targets on their back for the rest of us to throw rotten tomatoes at. Someone yesterday made the point about the modern day stocks. They've always got to put someone in the stocks for us to throw stuff at, and this generation are particularly vulnerable to that. And the old rhetoric of unemployment, the conflation with laziness, the claim that everyone's swinging the lead, even as the amount of support that people receive has diminished with every passing generation, the claim that they're somehow hogs in muck and living it up large on the back of the hard-working people of this country still works, because we're quite simple organisms when it comes down to it. But it's deeply unhelpful, because it creates conflict, stress and unhappiness in both sides. And the people being encouraged to be hateful, it's not good for them either. But it's even worse for the people that they are being encouraged to be hateful towards. And then the second reason why it's important that we call this out and swim in the opposite direction is because you're not going to fix things by misrepresenting the facts and by misrepresenting the people in the heart of the facts. Steve says flat screen TVs, which fits both with the political analysis I've just done and with the missing word round on the headlines. But no, Johnson has not blamed flat screen TVs for obesity, although a tenor says that some blowhard from the right wing has at some point in the past. It is 9 minutes after 11. So here's the headline that really caught my eye this morning. I want to get a job, but I don't know how. And I think we've missed these people. I only yesterday did we really get a proper bead on why, on who they are, where they are, and why they're in the situation that they're in. But this is something that, now you've mentioned it, it seems bleeding obvious. But it's a part of the problem that I want to explore a little further with you, with your help. I want to get a job, but I don't know how. So official figures, as we know, suggest that nearly a million young people between July and September of this year, and all right, some people might have taken the summer off, or they might have just come out of school and not yet got their act together, but that's the measure, that's the point we've got. Nearly a million young people out of education, employment or training. Government today announcing measures to help them back into work. We await some clarification on whether there will be actual punishments or reductions in benefit if they refuse that sort of help, if they fail to take up those sort of offers. But job centres and, crucially, mental health support will get more funding to help people into work. And the question of why they're not in work is one that today we'll examine from one angle and one angle only. And that angle is this: I want to get a job, but I don't know how. So they've got a 20-year-old in Birmingham who finished his A-levels in 2022, has been out of work ever since. Some of the elements we've touched on in our desperate quest to come to a better understanding of this phenomenon are very much in this lad's life, in Hassan's life. I've told you what he said. I want to get a job, but how do I get a job? This year has been a kind of constant struggle. How do I write the right CV? How do I apply for things? Now think about this. He missed out on sitting his GCSEs because of the COVID pandemic, which means the first formal exams he sat, the first public exams, the first experience he had of marching into that room with the invigilator and the clock ticking on the wall. I may be showing my age here, but I presume they've still got clocks ticking on the wall, and the paper in front of you and the warnings about what happens if you cheat. And it freaked him out. He said it was overwhelming. I realised, he says, that what I had been calling stress for many years was actually anxiety. I'd been carrying it with me for so long. He's now getting help from the King's Trust, the sort of organisation that the government is keen to support further. But because of his experiences in the final year at school, he put off applying to university. And now, given that tuition fees are going up, he's not even sure he wants to go to university. But he doesn't know how to go about getting a job. There's a 23-year-old in Coventry, Amy, who's got a degree in criminology. She went to university, police and investigation. She applies for jobs. She doesn't get any responses. She's been volunteering with the witness service for over a year, so she's not lazy. She's not work shy, but she can't find a job, and she wants a career. Last time she applied for a job was in victim support, but she was told she didn't have enough experience. And these lines here, what more can I give? I have a relevant degree and lots of volunteering experience. The morale sapping experience that she's going through is, if the option was there, precisely the kind of experience that could see someone giving up and then being stereotyped or characterised as someone who's spending all day in bed or playing video games all day. And then other people who simply don't know the rubric. Something got missed. It's a great article. It appears under the headline, I want to get a job, but I don't know how. I want my own case studies, obviously. That's what the phone lines are for. But I use that as a starting point because it's not something that we've explored together. What's your experience of unemployment? No, let me rephrase that. What's your experience of job seeking? I have none. Next to none. What's the anecdote I share at this point traditionally? Anybody? Bueller? I very nearly became a trainee sea lion trainer at West Midlands Safari Park as a consequence of going into the local job centre and seeing a postcard on a board and taking it down and taking it to the worker in the job centre and saying, I'd quite like to apply for this job. I got all the way to West Midlands Safari Park. I had my swimming trunks with me when I discovered what YTS meant. And it was a youth trainee scheme which didn't pay you as much as I would get for being a shop assistant at River Island in Worcester. And I wanted the job for the money. I didn't have a particular passion for sea lions then or now. So that was the last time, I think. Oh, no, I tell a lie. And then when I left university, I'd buy The Guardian every Monday and apply for all the jobs in the Media Guardian. And occasionally I'd get a reply telling me that I wasn't qualified. Suitably, with having absolutely no journalism qualifications and very little experience outside the retail world of doing anything. So that was it. Steve is on form today. In fact, I think he might just have stolen my dad joke crown, texting to say that would have been a flipping good job, James. Yeah, you're not wrong. So what is this 52-year-old man doing? And remember, there are people even older than me that would do this. Doing on the radio, talking as if he has even the vaguest idea about the job-seeking process. Only just caught myself in time. I was literally seeing that headline in the BBC, on the BBC website this morning, suddenly made me realise another problem with the way I've been conducting this conversation previously. Because it comes from a place of complete ignorance, which means you don't get the question right. It doesn't cross my mind that the actual rubric of applying for a job may be completely different from what it was when I was young. And we should have got it, because I mentioned to you yesterday some research into public attitudes to the DWP. Public attitudes among both employers and wannabe employees to the idea that the DWP is the place that you go to in search of work. It just isn't. We don't know anything. Or hopefully my callers do, but you and I don't know anything about what it is like to apply for jobs today. And that's got to be a huge part of the problem that Keir Starmer and his government are addressing. There's nearly 1 million young people out of education, employment or training. Some of them are just spinning. Some of them are just spinning without direction or without purpose. I'm not here to condemn their parents. I'm not here to condemn them. I'm here to come to a better understanding of how you get a job in 2024. Isn't that extraordinary? It's the 5th time that we've addressed this issue. And remember, I'm not taking all the blame for this, because you could have rung in at any point in all of these conversations to talk about and some people have admittedly talked about the difficulties of getting a job, but it's been subjective and individual, not systemic and objective. What is the system in this country now? When my late father was made redundant by the Daily Telegraph, I tell the same stories when we come round to the issue of unemployment, because all of my experience is 40 or 30 years out of date. That's the point that I'm making. Well, I've not actually realised it before. My late father was made redundant by the Daily Telegraph in about 1990. And one of the first things he did was go to the job centre, and I was mortified. Absolutely mortified. He didn't need the money. Had a very generous redundancy pay. Well, not generous. He got the money he was due. But I didn't want my dad going to the job centre. This is very much a legacy of Margaret Thatcher, isn't it? Right in the middle of it. And Dad explained to me, as he often did, in a way that made me see the world differently, that this was his right. Not the money necessarily, although he wasn't going to turn that down, but the support that was in place. We didn't have a fax machine at home. If he wanted, just ask your dad or your mum. We didn't have a fax machine at home, so if he wanted to send his CV to places, or he wanted some advice on technology or things that would change, there was a form of support in place that was still inadequate, but which filled a space that it seems to me is not being filled today. And this is important as well from Sam. I could look at the question from the other direction. I would like to employ the right person, but I don't know how. In my experience, I've observed that many job postings within my current organisation will list qualifications and experiences that seem disproportionate to the role, I believe part of the challenge here may lie in companies not fully understanding the type of candidate they need. So a breakdown, which makes the front page of the Times all the more powerful. Britain isn't working, admits Prime Minister in jobs push. So he talks about bosses needing to get better at keeping the long-term sick in their jobs. In other words, and the phrase, maybe the language isn't helpful here, for older employees, bosses need to recognise that productivity is linked to health. And the better looked after somebody is, the more likely they are to A, be in a job, and B, be producing the goods in that job. So they're going to overhaul job centres. They're going to send more NHS staff to areas with the highest rates of worklessness under plans to deal with unemployment and an objectively and irrefutably growing sickness crisis. So I will be... Well, no, I don't need to be that. Just tell me your experiences. How hard is it to find a job? But crucially, how hard is it to apply for? What happens? I'll take this from young and old. I'm particularly interested in young people, but I appreciate that this is tricky territory. Somebody who lost their job, let's say, and presumed things would be like they were 20 years ago. What is it actually like now? Where do you go? What help is available? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. What help is available? What do you say to an 18-year-old who has been battered really from pillar to post as a consequence of the pandemic, as a consequence, in his case, of mental health? But that doesn't necessarily apply to everybody. He simply says, I want to get a job, but I don't know how. What do you say to him? Hit the numbers now. You will get through.
James O'Brien on LBC.
2 minutes after 11, and here we are already with the evidence or the answers coming from older people as to why younger people find themselves in the pickle that they find themselves in. Sarah writes, finding a job in today's world involves navigating a gauntlet of websites, HR departments who don't understand what they're looking for, awful zombie job ads that aren't real, time-consuming forms and time-wasting job interviews that cost money to attend, all to be ghosted for months afterwards. Steve writes, I was recently made redundant at 58, having worked for a high street bank since I dropped out of university in 1985. I went to the local job centre, but they told me they only really cater for people on benefits. They just pointed me to a couple of Facebook groups, and that was it. And Dave makes a point that I think is fair. If only young people had a whole continent available to them in which they could freely find jobs. Yeah, it might help, but I don't know that it would solve the problem that we're describing today. And I'm James O-Brexit. So if I don't think this is down to Brexit, then it probably isn't. Archie's in Islington. Archie, what made you pick up the phone?
Yeah, morning, James.
Hello, Archie.
So, I thought I was doing everything right when I left school. So I got decent enough grades just because that's what sort of my school wanted. Yes. And I looked at the university ranking tables and thought, I've got the grades, I can go for the top. Got into UCL, studied economics there, and I sort of ended that experience and started looking for jobs. And I had no experience prior, so I understand that that's a valued part of the application process. And it was just getting sort of knocked back. Went to do a master's at Imperial College, where I was lucky enough to do 2 internships, and then left that experience now, where I've been applying for jobs for the past 4 months. And I'm now in the position where my parents, who'd been supporting me through university, and that was very lucky,
sure.
They subsidised my rent. So I live in North London. It's not a cheap place to live.
No.
And the agreement that I had arranged with my parents was that they are going to subsidise my rent so long as I'm looking for employment. And if I'm not in employment within a certain time frame, they can't justify letting me live in another city. So after this Christmas, I'll be moving back in home with my parents with 2 degrees, a first-class honours in economics, 3 internship experiences, and I've had companies citing economic uncertainty, ending interviews almost in the 4th stage. So I've had, these interviews are outrageous. Yeah. You are meeting with a HR interviewer, you are sitting assessments which come with a range of formats, whether that be numerical assessments or psychometric assessments, that it's just utterly bemusing. And to be honest, I don't think I've done that much wrong, but I feel completely disillusioned with it. Like it's hard, especially when I've got relationships in London. My girlfriend's here, and I'm now in a situation where I'm moving back up to Edinburgh. Like it's I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's heartbreaking. And I don't want to add to your burdens, but just to clarify a couple of things. You are choosing not to take a job simply to pay your way, to take a job that doesn't involve your qualifications. And I'm not suggesting you should, certainly not yet. And that's a horrible spectre on the horizon. But you want to work in a field that allows you to use the skills and the knowledge that you've accrued over the last 6 or 7 years at a very high level.
Yeah, so I have been working sort of a part-time employment as a waiter whilst I'm doing my application. So I work a 30-hour week just to cover my end of the rent, in addition to sitting interviews, arranging interviews, preparing for those interviews.
Oh, mate, you've been through it, haven't you? You really have. How do you compare to your peer group, to the people that you studied with, the people that you graduated with?
I mean, I look around just because the universities I've been to do sort of breed a certain driven individual who I now see doing very well. So I do have friends that have succeeded in their...
Yeah, but they're no more driven than you.
Well, it's... Yeah, but that's the luck of the game, isn't it? And it feels a bit... I don't know, downtrodden. I mean, I just don't feel I'm doing anything wrong. But then I'm looking at sort of a track record of, no, not today. Maybe your qualification looked okay, but not this time. And I'm thinking that there is something systematically wrong with my applications or how I come across in the interview.
Seems unlikely, because there'll be an awful lot of people in the same position that you're in, but you won't be thinking about them. You'll be thinking about the people that have pulled it off, in quotes, and comparing yourself with them. It's tough. I mean, I'm certainly not in a position to give you advice, but I'm grateful to you for, in the space of a single phone call, completely exploding the narrative about your generation in a way, and the idea that it's somehow a laziness or an inability to work. I hear a desperation to work and a perfectly understandable desire to work in a way that puts your life's work so far, your education, to proper use. Listen, Edinburgh's not... Well, you know this, Archie. Edinburgh's not like the Boondocks, mate. There's banks and houses in Edinburgh that you could apply to, isn't there?
Yeah, so that's actually where I did a summer internship in Edinburgh, but I've now been in London for 4 years. I began my sort of university experience in London. Fantastic city. Where I now have the predominant group of my friends, and as I mentioned, a relationship.
I've got an emotional urge to make you feel a little bit better, but that runs the risk of me coming across as condescending, for which I apologise, or at least patronising. But a quick word, if you would, on the process. So when I was your age, I was looking to work in a very specific sector. I could buy a newspaper that had, say, 100 jobs in that sector. What do you do? How do you find opportunities?
Yeah, so I have a range of different sources. So I'm predominantly looking in financial services. So there are dedicated careers websites to that. Things like Bristol Tracker, eFinancial Careers, Bright Network. There is a wealth of resources you can use to find and locate the jobs. But I mean, finding the job's the easiest part. It's right. The application cycle that is the most tumultuous, and I suppose it should be given how competitive they are. But bearing in mind you're applying to hundreds of these, they pile up on each other. And and in some ways, the way you describe it, it might be the easiest part, but it sounds like a full-time job, even doing the applying, doing the applications. Archie, I listen, again, at risk of sounding patronising, I just, in the basis of this conversation, I think you're going to be fine, but I know what it's like. I know what it's like to wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and think it's never going to happen. It's just not going to, and there's no earthly way I can guarantee that it will or promise you that it will. All I can say is that this old geezer on the radio was where you are now.
many, many years ago, and just kept plugging away, with the advantages you've described as well. So I'm fully aware there'll be plenty of people listening to this who wouldn't have been able to dream of doing master's degrees or even staying in London in the circumstances that you've described. But that's the point, isn't it? So once you strip away the lazy attempts to pigeonhole everybody, to categorise an entire generation as being X, Y or Z, then the nuance appears, the complexities appear, and the political challenge becomes not just clearer, but urgent. Take care, mate. Thomas Watts has your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
Okay, here's something that's never happened before, as far as I'm aware. You might want to write this down. I think I might have been wrong to minimise the impact of Brexit on the conversation that we're having. Quite a few of you crossed with me about that. I hate to say it, James, but I think Brexit has quite a big part to play in all this. So many of these high-paying jobs in finance, this is particularly relevant to Archie's case, and IT, etc., are now being more easily filled by candidates from all over the world to the detriment of local talent. The UK's immigration policy has made it a lot easier to find cheaper talent from outside. Indeed, there was another one as well, which made exactly the same point, albeit in slightly different language. Brexit is a contributor. And I've heard all the other valid reasons, and I agree it's not all Brexit's fault, writes Mac Takashi. However, 20% of job positions lost since 2016 would still be here if we were in the EU. No source provided there. And the contributors mentioning ghost job ads, etc., also point to Brexit. And then there's the very personal experiences. Helen writes, I live in a village just outside Ledbury, that's in Herefordshire. The only jobs frequently advertised are cleaning or care work. I can't do these jobs due to arthritis and polymyalgia. There is nothing part-time, but I want to work. I've been looking for 8 years. Being rural is a huge barrier, which hasn't even mentioned public transport, how difficult it is to get around if you're in the countryside. Eleanor, who's on holiday this week, the regular producer of this programme, doesn't let me talk about buses. I find buses fascinating. I think buses are a much more important element of our lives than people realise. But they're one of those things that if you don't use them, you don't see them. Well, I know you see them. They're bloody huge. But buses, if you live in a rural... Remember, I grew up in the countryside. I grew up on a farm. I don't know if I ever mentioned that. If you grow up in the countryside, buses are your lifeline. And, you know, the cost of fuel, the cost of living, the cost of cars, increasing exponentially all the time. A good bus service is the difference between having a job and not having a job. Yeah, I'm not even I'm not exaggerating, but sometimes, the four walls of this studio in London's fashionable Leicester Square start to close in on me, and I forget what it's like out there. Outside London, outside the M25. I've told you a few times, on a good day, I step out of my front door, I walk a couple of 100 yards, and the bus is pulling up at the bus stop as I arrive at the bus stop, and I don't like to slow down or speed up. On the best days, I just step without changing my pace at all. I don't know why I'm miming this with my fingers and my left hand playing the bus door, but you can see it now on YouTube in case you think I'm making this up. So I'm walking like this, the bus comes in, I don't change my pace, the door opens, I step on, click myself in, go and sit down. In fact, growing up in Worcestershire, I've told you before, I think it's changed now. There was one bus at the end of my lane, where the farm I grew up on was. There was one bus at the end of the lane, the farm lane, where it went to Bridgnorth every Tuesday. That was the bus. And what if I got a job in Bridgnorth? I'm sorry, boss, I can only come in on Tuesdays. That's just extraordinary. But it's no laughing matter. 11:37 is the time. The difficulty of finding a job when you really, really want one has thus far been missing from our conversation. So we're fixing it today. Max is in Barnet. Max, what made you pick up the phone?
Hey, so I've recently graduated from uni, was looking for work, recently found work, but it's just been absolutely so difficult. So when I hear people complaining about it, I do, empathize with the students right now. Myself, I took a bit of a different route. I left college and then I went straight into work. So I worked various different jobs in sales and some bar jobs as well. That was when I was about 18, 19 as well. And then I decided I wanted to shift and pursue going into finance. So I went to university a bit late. And so I've come out with work experience
first class.
And qualifications. Another first class. Yeah. I think only people with first class degrees listen to this programme from your generation, Max. I've got no idea why. Keith also has a first class degree, I should mention, but he's much older than you. What was your experience when you graduated? Do you think that it would be a relatively easy passage into paid employment relative to the qualifications that you'd got?
I thought at the very least I'd get something relevant, something, nothing specifically high paying at the start or anything like that.
Sure.
But I thought I'd get something relevant fairly quickly, especially coming from the fact that I had some work experience before as well. But
so
no,
what happened?
I was just hundreds of applications.
Really?
And it's not like when I was applying for a job when I was 18 and the application was send off your CV, someone would give you a ring, you'd have a telephone call, then they'd let you know whether you want to come in for an interview. No, you go through a whole process of filling out, answering, 10 different questions, 1,000 words each for each application.
Why?
Psychometric tests.
What are they trying to do? Does it work?
Absolutely not. It's ridiculous because a lot of these jobs, if you speak to anyone, if you were to get someone who works at that job to do any of those tests, I guarantee you most of them would probably fail the test, so there wouldn't be any usefulness anyways in terms of whether you can do the job and whether you're...
Where does that come from, do you think? Is that just a sort of an overreach of HR departments?
It's just this outsourcing, the way we're going now. It's rather than actually having someone do the hiring process, you can just filter through everyone through these tests.
And so the huge majority of people applying are completely wasting their time.
Yep. And then you do that over and over and over again. And then even if you are lucky enough to pass the test, you then get through to a phone interview, and like I did in a couple ones, you get through to then the assessment center tests where you're doing that.
When you came on the line at the beginning of this call, I don't know if you noticed, but you did. Did you? I don't suppose you're familiar with Happy Days, are you? The comedy series from the 70s and the 80s.
I'm not. No.
Have you never heard of the character of the Fonz?
Nope.
No, so he did this thing where when he'd walk into the diner, it's an American comedy, and he'd just go, "Hey!" And for some reason, you did this at the beginning of this call. And I'm just wondering whether you adopted that tactic during the phone interviews that you were doing back in the day, Matt.
Perhaps that wasn't why I was getting through, maybe.
I want this job. So what happened? What was different about the job you got, as it were?
The job I got completely just came out of the blue, and they found me. They found my CV on obviously one of the many job sites that I had it listed. And they said, we think you'd be a good fit, and that was actually one of the really great application process. I had to do a couple of the kind of psychometric tests, but nothing crazy. Then it was a phone interview, and then Zoom interview, and then face to face, and
And it's working out well.
Yeah, it's working out very well. It's great.
I'm glad to hear it. You deserve it. And it's also and for that period of time when you were looking for work, would you have been one of these statistics? You'd have been registered as not working or being in education between graduation and finding the job?
Yep, I was on the job seekers allowance as well, and with the job centre, which was absolutely useless in terms of helping you find a job.
And that's the generational divide, is that we don't know that. My generation don't know that. It serves no purpose in the job finding process or the job seeking process. And speaking of the process, Marita writes, the process being described sounds absolutely soul destroying. It does. Max, take care. And also, mate, look up Fonz. Hey, it's fantastic TV. It's where the phrase "jump the shark" comes from. Did you know that? That's literally where the phrase comes from. 11:41 is the time. Very, very specific question text. This is very niche. Bespoke radio phone-in. This I've lost it. I think it was Richard or Stephen who said you could get the Severn Valley Railway, which is true. You could get the Severn Valley Railway from Kidderminster to Bridge North, but I'd have to get from the farm to the station in Kidderminster, which admittedly would have been a little bit easier, I suppose, than getting a bus to Bridge North. But we might be overthinking this particular element of my contribution to this conversation. The Severn Valley Railway is a tourist attraction. It's going to cost a hell of a lot more to get a return ticket to Bridge North and back than it would to get normal public transport. It's a steam train. Everyone knows that. 11:42. Katie's in Brighton. Katie, what made you pick up the phone?
I just wanted to share something, James. My son has recently he was made redundant.
Okay.
And he's been applying for jobs, and I kept saying to him, ring up the National Careers Service because that's what they're trained to do, help you find a job. So, and did he listen? No, because apparently boys don't listen to their mums. And finally, after months of applying, getting no acknowledgements whatsoever, he rang the Careers Service, who told him, this is quite interesting, so they told him all job applications get filtered through some big machine. Now, don't ask me what that was, but if they don't meet 80%, then they're just binned.
Yeah.
And his was at 75. So there's some mechanism on the website whereby you can feed your CV through and get it assessed. And they give you advice on how to tweak it and what, certain areas.
Well, that's good to know, because do you know something weird? Yeah. As you are speaking, Matt texts me to say, I'm an internal recruiter, James. I'm literally going through CVs at this very second, and I can tell you from first-hand experience that CV writing and interview techniques need to be taught in schools.
Absolutely.
So the other thing that kicks in here is yet more social immobility, isn't it? Because if you're at private school, this is going to be looked after and addressed a lot more keenly than it is at state schools. And, of course, the more school you missed as a consequence of lockdowns, the more you're likely to suffer. And now you're in the cohort of people being signed off or written up as not in work, education or training.
Sure.
Has he got a job now?
He's very hopeful that he's just had an interview this week, but he certainly started getting more interviews once he tweaked his CV.
That's very interesting. And it's soul destroying, right? I mean, it's bad enough.
It is horrendous. And from a mother's point of view, to turn on the radio and hear the incidents of suicide amongst young men, you just think, what are we doing to our young people? What are we doing? How are we helping them? It seems like every door slams in their face, and it's heartbreaking.
It is, and the encouragement to obsess about other things is constant and incredibly loud. But this is a social problem. It's a societal problem, not an individual problem or even a generational problem. We all suffer. Also stressing, I like this from Charlie. I don't know that I need to do this, Charlie, because I don't know that I've done the opposite so far. But please explain to everyone that redundancy means the position has been made redundant, not the person. That is correct. It doesn't always work out like that, of course, which is one of the reasons employment tribunals exist. But yeah, I mean, you wouldn't want that to be sort of hanging above your head, that word or that perception. The job no longer exists, therefore you don't have a job. It shouldn't be a reflection on you, but I guess most of us would take it that way. CV writing is offered by the job centre as a workshop, says Daniel. 11:45 is the time.
James O'Brien on LBC.
11:48. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. You know their feature Missed Information that we are in the process of launching. I believe that a jingle is in the production process. I did something very clever. I pointed out how the newsagents get whatever they ask for, honestly. It's ermine. John Sopel sits in an ermine-lined chair in the office. I can't get anything. I can't even get a sandwich. But the newsagents asked for it. They get it yesterday. So I thought I'll get one of the newsagents to do the jingle, and then everything will start moving a lot more quickly. So I'm delighted to say that Emily Maitlis has recorded a selection of voiceovers, which means that soon I will get my Missed Information jingle, by which point I will almost certainly have forgotten what Missed Information as a feature on the programme was supposed to be about. It's a sting, not a jingle. Or, if you prefer, a stingle. But here is an extraordinary example of what that feature exists to point out, although it is to the Labour MP Torsten Bell that I turn for the guidance on this. So, speaking of farms, because I grew up on one, although for the avoidance of doubt we didn't farm it, the Times ran a piece on the 19th of November about that demonstration in Westminster by farmers opposed to changes in inheritance tax. And in this article, Torsten Bell has realised that they told the story of John Kemp Welsh, described in the article as Kemp Welsh, 88, who owns 5,000 acres of, quotes, difficult hill farming land in Perthshire, where he and his children farm black-face sheep. It was quite a poignant piece. One of those farmers standing with his daughter and son-in-law in the bitter cold was Sir John Kemp Welsh, 88, who owns 5,000 acres of difficult hill farming land in Perthshire, where he and his children farm black-faced sheep. So, listen, I need to say from the start, it may well be that there are two 88-year-old men in this country called John Kemp Welsh, all right? And if that is the case, then this doesn't qualify as an example of missed information. But it seems unlikely, right? Should we go on? What they don't mention is anything else about John Kemp Welsh. There's even a nice photograph of him, beyond presenting him as a struggling farmer. Now, there is another 88-year-old John Kemp Welsh who was chair of the actual London Stock Exchange from 1994 to 2000. Before that, he spent 3 decades at the stockbroker Cazenove, and subsequently joined the board of HSBC. Companies House confirms that this is in fact the same person. So the Times reports him as a struggling hill farmer with 5,000 acres in Perthshire, and doesn't mention that he ran the stock exchange, spent 30 years as a stockbroker, and joined the board of HSBC. In much the same way that when they talked about the plight of James Dyson, the vacuum cleaner tycoon, they didn't mention that he reportedly owns more land than the actual king. So that is why misinformation exists, and that is why soon it will be a regular feature on this programme with its own stingle. But for now, it's back to the jobs market. And this extraordinary omission from all of the conversations that we've had and heard, and it's a generational mistake. It's because things are so different now from what they were when the people who conduct these conversations, i.e. idiots like me, experienced when they were looking for work or when they were in the job-seeking environment. It's absolutely huge. An enormous factor in the whole process is the madness of the job application procedure. It's gravitated a bit towards degree level, and I acknowledge that, and I'm aware of it. I can't control who rings in. But remember, we can do it on another day, or you've got 8 minutes to squeeze in now if you can bring something to the table from a non-degree experience. All welcome, always. Charlie's in Sheffield. Charlie, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. How are you?
I'm very well, Charlie. What's on your mind?
Well, basically, I want to give a bit of an experience of my recent employment, I guess. So you were saying basically we're gravitating towards degree level. I didn't start out going the degree route. I was originally as an engineer for a few years, then in the apprenticeship route. Wanted to change over to do English literature, something I'm more interested in. I ended up earning 2 degrees in English literature. The idea being I'd get a cafe job right on the side and make something as a writer as much as I can.
Okay.
I've successfully published my first poetry collection and working on other things. Working at a university cafe job for the last 3 years, but 2 months ago, I was made essentially redundant.
Okay.
In that they closed the university cafe that I was working at. So I'm technically still employed by them, but they've massively reduced hours, so I've got no hours of employment. So I worked there for 3 years, but then nothing comes of that. So it's like, okay, I've heard of this before. You can deal with this a bit, I suppose.
Right.
I also work for a magazine and a separate poetry press, unpaid.
Yeah.
I'm applying for roles within the career that I've gone to university for to better myself in, but I simply have no idea how you get that role, because we'll get onto that probably in a bit. For the sake of getting money coming in now, it was something you mentioned before, I think, or someone mentioned before, the application of getting jobs. So I'm applying for things like supermarkets and retail and what have you. It's not enough nowadays, it seems, to just give in your CV and your cover letter and state how valuable you are for the role. It seems you have to regurgitate every detail of the CV and the cover letter. And I won't mention the supermarket because I'm not sure I'm allowed to, but there was one I applied for recently where there's no joke of a lie here, is that 48 free-choice questions of which one are you more likely to be.
Like a psychometric test of your personality.
Yeah, a bloke mentioned that before, but I didn't know what that meant.
I think that's the same thing. Is
that it?
I think so. I could be wrong. Someone will soon tell me if I am. And this was to get a job in a supermarket. And neither of us are looking down on jobs in supermarkets, but we're a little bit confused. A little bit confused about why you'd need to do a psychometric test to get one.
Well, yeah, essentially. I mean, I can see why they do it, because you're dealing with customer service, and customers can be.
You're not going to say, in the event of a customer complaining, are you more likely to agree with them and do your best to help them, or B, punch them in the face? No one's going to tick B, are they?
This is the thing. So they ask you these questions in a polite way, but the thing is, they have said there's 3 choices for the first question. On the second question, you get 2 of the previous 2 choices. So, like, you can go against yourself, if you see what I mean. And it's like, can I do the job or can I not do the job? Is it why is it as hard as this? What is happening here? So I think, all right, I'll park that for one side for those retail kind of jobs. Let's apply for a role that I'm qualified in now because I've got the degrees and I've worked hard for it. Coming from a working class background in the north, every role within publishing, which I'm qualified for, is in London, pays about 25 grand a year. And you've got absolutely no chance of going to, if you're not from Oxbridge and you've done 9 years worth of unpaid experience before.
You've closed that.
By the way, I've got a second-class degree, so that's kind of diversifying your...
All human life is here, Charlie. What's the name of your poetry collection, if people want to go and have a look at it?
It's called It's Like This by Charlie Parker. It's published by Written Off Publishing, based in Manchester. And on top of that, just as a last point, sorry.
Yes, of course.
When you do get the multiple rejection emails, either from the publishing companies or the retail outlets, they'll just this is another important point for anybody listening, is that they never offer feedback. I wish that any time they'd say, but more specifically perhaps, because I understand the retail jobs would get 1,000 people applying for one role perhaps, but the publishing might be a slightly bit more niche.
Of course, a bit more rarefied. That makes feedback more important, doesn't it? Of course.
Sure. They say, unfortunately, due to the large number of applicants, we don't have any feedback for you, and it's like, great.
Well, what do I do now? I'm just going to do the same thing again next time because I don't know what I've done wrong this time. I'll read you this, Charlie. It might be relevant from Keno. I work for a charity that advises people on finding work. Most of them will have had a CV created by other services. I can tell you that 95% of them are appalling. It's an exercise in cutting and pasting words and phrases just to hit a target. There's no individualisation or even anything that targets the actual job they are applying for. So what would the word be? A homogenous CV, I suppose. A one-size-fits-all. I'm sure this isn't what you're doing, but it is feedback of a kind from someone in the field. Disrespectful to employers and totally counterproductive for the job seeker. And yet, of course, someone's got a job going through all that, wasting their time and wasting the time of the people applying without any prospect of getting a job at the end of the process. Thank you, Charlie. Stay safe. We might shift a few copies of the poetry book with a bit of luck. Last word on this to Tony, who's in Erith. Tony, what made you pick up the phone?
Hi, James. I've been a recruiter for 26 years. Before the advent of modern technology, job boards online, that kind of thing, right the way through to now. And to me, the fundamental thing is that nobody knows how to write a CV anymore.
That's mad, isn't it?
The youngsters these days, coming out of school, college, they're not taught these skills. There are three fundamental things that need to appear in a CV, and they are objective, your value as an individual, and your motivation.
And your name.
And obviously your name.
And your phone number.
And your phone number and where you live. I see so many CVs. I have over 300 applications for a reception admin role based in Penge.
Oh, yeah. Why did you say Penge like that? Why did you say Penge with such contempt then, Tony?
It wasn't with contempt.
Was it not? It just came out that way. Penge, you said. You said admin role based in Penge.
Penge is a wonderful community because, like you say, we're blessed with a fantastic transport system in the suburbs of London.
There you go. He's gone bi-topical. Right. Yes, go on.
But 300 applications. I'm phoning up candidates that I think have got some really good skills and perhaps some value to find out that they're living in somewhere like Enfield or Watford. The commutable distance is not going to be viable for somebody coming to Penge when you've got a lot of other candidates that are living nearby.
Very good point.
So, like you said, other callers have said, make the CV relevant. It doesn't have to be homogenised. It just needs that person to think, hold on, where's my value? Read the job description, tweak the CV.
It's depressing, isn't it? I'm out of time. But you've made some excellent points, and it's depressing to think that you wouldn't just say, what would I want to see if I was giving this job? That's what I'd do. If I was Tony, and I was in charge of hiring an admin assistant in Penge, then what would I want to see on the CV, and then fill it in accordingly? It automatically becomes a little bit more personal. Listen, Andrew in Penzance seems like a stand-up guy to me. I've not heard of this before. I was in a supermarket the other day. I asked a member of staff for help to find a bottle of wine. After 2 minutes, that's quite a long time, but nevertheless, the manager appeared and told him to get back to stacking shelves as the machine monitoring his output had alerted her to his inactivity. Who would want to work like that? I've not heard of that before. I know that football players carry monitors so that the coach can sort of work out what they've been up to during the course of a game. I had no idea it happened in supermarkets too.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It's 5 minutes after 12 and you're listening to LBC. Can I do a bit of housework first before we launch into the next conversation, which is going to be linked to the report this morning that the number of women who aren't in relationships having IVF in order to become mothers has increased. I think it's tripled. But first of all, let me deal with the final round of the, or maybe not the final round, depends whether or not I come across any others during the next little hiatus. But the missing word round, Johnson blames blank for Britain's obesity crisis. Some splendid answers coming into this, and one day I'll get the hang of using my inbox in a way that allows me to share some of them with you. It wasn't me. I sound like Shaggy now. It wasn't Gary Lineker. It wasn't Carol Vorderman. It wasn't all the usual suspects that get the blame for anything that the right wing fancy blaming on them. It wasn't even Brexit, as a couple of you suggested. Johnson blames church for Britain's obesity crisis. And no, not Charlotte, the church. Boris Johnson has blamed the Church of England for Britain's obesity crisis, saying that its failure to provide people with the spiritual sustenance they need is leading people to gorge themselves. I mean, the idea that we should stop treating Boris Johnson as someone with anything valid or important to say about anything, I'm afraid that ship has sailed. We lost that battle. But here it is. He's criticised Justin Welby for going on about slavery reparations rather than addressing people's spiritual needs, apparently not occurring to him that having enslaved ancestors might have an absolutely crucial role in your spiritual status, particularly as a member of something called the Church of England. But hey-ho, there it is. Johnson blames church for Britain's obesity crisis. Actually, Charlotte Church could have been on that list of people who usually get blamed by the right wing whenever anything goes wrong, couldn't it? She'd be like an associate member alongside the Holy Trinity of Lineker, Vorderman and me, Charlotte Church, on the sidelines. 7 minutes after 12 is the time. And a quick word to Jonathan. I don't understand the message, Jonathan, but I do worry when people worry. And he says, I'm beginning to worry that my jingle had annoyed you. And now you've confirmed it. I'm sorry, I wouldn't have done it if I didn't think it would. I haven't heard it. I don't know what you meant. I absolutely can swear to you that there is no judgment of your jingle. I would never judge another man's jingle. It's not my place. You learn that at boarding school. I don't know what you mean, but I absolutely haven't been annoyed by anything that you've done. I promise you. 7 minutes after 12 is the time. Of course, as Andrew points out, you could make a much stronger case for explaining why slavery contributed to obesity, with the role that sugar plays in the actual condition and the medical process. But that wouldn't occur to Boris Johnson, would it? So, conversation we're going to have next comes from a couple of interesting places, but it's not necessarily going to go in the direction that you might expect. I think that there is an element of negativity involved. I don't know if you heard the fella last week who was blaming women for everything. We were talking about Captain Tom in the context of his family being found to have behaved in a less than optimal way in the conduct of their financial affairs, and the money that many people buying Captain Tom's books thought would be going to charities or to the NHS, instead ending up in the pockets of his family members. And a lad rang in from Scotland, absolutely adamant that it was because of women. I failed you. I let you down. I didn't really get to the bottom of why women, as a kind of species, not a species, as a section of society, were to blame for. It's because they do too much stuff, I think. Was that what he said? What did he say? He said they do stuff. They do all the shopping. Because women do all the shopping. That's why people ended up giving so much money to Captain Tom, I think, or something. So we're definitely not going to be engaging in any low-level or indeed high-level misogyny here. And the idea that a single woman should not be undergoing fertility treatment to start a family is quite offensive to me. But whenever a producer mentions stories like this, a surge in single women having IVF or donor insemination, the first question I ask them is, but what are the actual numbers? Because, 10% of very little is even littler. 100% of very little is very little twice. So what are the actual numbers? And I don't know how socially significant the numbers are. 4,800 women who had no partner went through in vitro fertilization or donor insemination in 2022. It's a 243% increase. But 10 years previously, the figure stood only at 1,400. So it's not a huge social issue or a moment. But it means that about 400 single women are undergoing fertility treatment every month. And that means it's about 10%, just under 10% of all fertility treatments administered in the UK. And that has more than doubled since 2012. But I'm going to tell you a couple of things now. And this is becoming a bit of a theme on the programme. And I'm not going to lie to you, I absolutely love it. I think a little bit of minor trumpet blowing here. I think it's so at odds with what goes on in so much of the media that it becomes almost a public service, at least for me, if not for you, to work out why you get things wrong, to work out why you're wrong about stuff. So in the last hour, we suddenly realised that part of the reason why the conversation about young people finding work has been so unsatisfactory is that we're applying the job-seeking process of 20, 30, 40 years ago to the job-seeking process of today, when they are in fact two completely different things. And I have, over the years, and if you've only discovered this programme quite recently, you might find this a little bit hard to believe. I don't mean that in a self-referential way. I mean the level of obnoxiousness that I would deploy when talking about people who did things I didn't think I approved of was much more typical of the genre than we are today. So I was, as I've told you on many, many occasions, I was pretty hideous on the issue of obesity. And when I say hideous, I just sounded like your average blowhard or your average right-wing columnist. And on the issue of marriage, Sam knows what I'm talking about. He's already messaged to say how we miss the days when you lauded marriage as the only successful route to raising children. And you're thinking, you did what? And I'm thinking, I did what? And I did. And I've worked out why. I worked out why in my second book, How Not to Be Wrong. And it's quite interesting. And not because I'm interesting, but because digging into why you honestly believed things that were profoundly offensive to many other people is a really helpful and interesting thing to do. So this is, it's not difficult for me to share this. It's just difficult for me to get my ducks in a row so that I can explain it simply and quickly. Why did I have such negative... So I'd stick up for single mothers because they were getting abuse from the people who've now largely turned their attention to asylum seekers and refugees. Single mothers, when I started in this job, were the target du jour for the tabloids. It was Andrew Neil, actually, at the Sunday Times, who first directed the target of incoherent fury at some of the most vulnerable members of society. When he was the editor there, he published a bloke who thought that people should be sterilised or have their children taken away. Single mothers demonized in a hideous way. So my kind of slightly lazy underdog protection syndrome kicked in, and I would be able to defend single mothers. I'd be able to stick up for single mothers. But at the same time, I was pretty obnoxious about unmarried parents. I would describe marriage as the gold standard of relationships, and I would want to know why you weren't married. If you were prepared to make a commitment as significant as having a child, why on earth would you not make a commitment in front of your friends and family, and if you had faith, in front of your God? And then when I came to write How Not to Be Wrong, which was very much a consequence of therapy and going through journeys and experiences designed to help me change the way I approached the world and the way I approached problems. I used to be a classic public school cliche. I thought you could kind of cajole and bustle your way out of trouble in the way that people like Boris Johnson still believe. And I just thought it might be interesting to look at other things where I was probably wrong. And I'd work out whether I was wrong or not by the reaction of people around me. So, for example, I have family members who are unmarried parents, but I wouldn't think of them when I was waxing lyrical on the radio about how that was not the right way in which to raise a family. And I would mean it. I would mean it in my own mind. In that moment, I would mean it. So I dug in to why, and it was the most extraordinary thing. I'm not going to take another 5 minutes to tell you. I'm going to go to the break. I'm going to come back and tell you why I ended up with opinions relating to marriage that were pretty much identical to Ian Duncan Smith's. Now, there's an alarm bell we should all heed. If you find yourself, except on Matters International, because it turns out that Ian Duncan Donuts is actually really strong on Brits imprisoned abroad and the dangers of getting too close to China and stuff like that. But if it's on what you could call social policy, if it's on how we look after people in society who are different from us, if you find yourself sounding a bit like Ian Duncan Smith, it's time to give your head the mother of all wobbles. So we'll come back in a minute. I'll tell you why I had ended up being a kind of Ian Duncan Donuts tribute act on the issue of marriage. And then we will talk about what it's like to have, not to be, but to have a single parent, I think, or maybe to be as well, because I don't know that there is anything more interesting about single women undergoing fertility treatment than there is about single women having a baby via more traditional circumstances. It's the desire to be a parent that kicks in here. And having had fertility treatment, it's almost like I've got a dog in all these races. I don't feel it's any different. The impulse you feel to become a parent has nothing to do with the means you employ to achieve it. So that will follow, and then I need your calls.
James O'Brien on LBC.
12:17 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. So, and oddly, Jane got close to this. I probably explained it before, but I don't think Jane is cheating. Before that, this from Martin. Sometimes I get cross with you, James, and sometimes you wake me up and change my mind. But today you have taught me something extremely important. Never judge another man's jingle. This was worth me taking today off work for. Thank you. Martin, I am here to serve. So when I dug into why I had these obnoxious attitudes about marriage, I realised that it was linked to my adoption, would you believe, which is odd given that my biological mother would have been a single mother if I hadn't been adopted. And what had happened when Mum and Dad were explaining to my sister and I about our adoption was that the explanation always involved our biological mothers not being able to look after us very well, or not being able to give us the life that Mum and Dad would be able to give us, which is factually correct, evidentially true. But subconsciously, I'd processed this, you see, so that I thought every child would have their best chance in life if they were being raised by a married couple, because the absence of marriage in the case of my biological mother was part of the story. And so through the mangle of my own mind, that sense that you are lucky to be with your mum and dad, partly because they are married, got somehow transformed into derision directed at unmarried couples. And it's a work in progress, because I sit here now at 90 minutes after 12 and think better than I used to think. I'd no longer get on my high horse about marriage, but I would perhaps find myself susceptible to the idea that a child is better off with two parents than one. I don't think I would go down the heteronormative route, but I probably would have done once. Mothers and fathers play different roles. One is a nurturer, I don't think that's true, really. And if it is, it's social conditioning. It's not innate or genetic. But the idea that two parents are better than one is still something that I am probably held hostage by. Not a lot, but I don't have much experience of single parenting, of single parent friends. I have some, but I don't have much. And so there's another thing where does that idea come from? Awful lot. I've got the experience of divorced parents raising children separately, but I never know quite whether that counts as being a single parent, raising children together but apart, if you see what I mean. So there's the question. I mean, make it relevant to the IVF if you want, but at the moment I don't currently see why it is. The conscious decision to be a single parent. So you haven't, some people have single parenthood thrust upon them. Some people have a child with someone with whom they thought they were going to be spending their lives, thought they were going to be raising the child together. But If that's not you, if you wanted to be a parent, and it's going to be almost all mothers, but I presume it's possible for fathers as well with the advent of surrogacy and other factors. Karen asks, is the mangle of your mind anywhere near the windmills of your mind? It's right next door. You consciously want to be a single parent. I want to know what it's like. I want to know what it's like socially. I wonder if anyone is in a position to make comparisons between now and 20 years ago. I mean, obviously, technically you could be, because you had a child 20 years ago as a single parent and you had another one 20 years later. But I think that would be quite a big ask. 0345 6060 973. Jake makes the point that should automatically puncture my pomposity on the question of two parents being better than one by simply saying, are two bad parents better than one bad one? But what is it like to consciously decide to have a child on your own in our modern world? Okay, 0345 6060 973. And then question number 2 is, as the child of a single parent, you can't compare your experience to the theoretical you that had two parents. I know you can't, but you can compare yourself to most other people around you when you were young. It's probably not so much true now, but how different do you feel as the child of a deliberately single parent? Hit the numbers now, you will get through. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. I'm really interested by this because I heard some of the coverage and there was still a kind of 1970s sense that women have got no business having babies on their own. And the IVF angle was a convenient hook upon which to hang that prejudice. And I'm not stupid enough to ignore the fact that I can feel that prejudice, a very small slither of that prejudice still present inside me. That's social conditioning. No one's born thinking two parents are better than one. So this is such a long introduction. I'd love to get a call on before past. I just wanted to dig in quite deeply as to why I ended up feeling so oddly and so wrongly about this issue. But I need your help and I'd like to get it in early. What's it like to become a single parent deliberately, to have a baby on your own? What challenges do you face that the rest of us will not be aware of? What reception do you receive from family and from friends? What did your mum say when you said, I'm going to have a baby on my own? It may be that your answer is, no biggie, James, I don't know what you're making such a fuss about. Or it may be that you can tell us stuff that we simply wouldn't appreciate without listening to you. And then as the child of the single parent, most commonly, I think the single mother, then what was it like for you? Where does this go? What is the difference between your childhood experience and what you think was the childhood experience of the people around you? All right? It's 24 minutes after 12. The number you need is 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. You've got a lot of women thawing eggs. You've got a lot of women freezing eggs. I guess one goes hand in hand with the other. And you've got a lot of women who are not in relationships, who don't have partners, making a conscious decision to become parents. I just want to talk through the whys and the wherefores. Hit the numbers now. You will get through. Lucia is in Putney to kick things off. Lucia, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello.
I just caught the beginning of that. I hope I haven't missed anything. Just to say that I am what I would call a solo or single mum by choice.
Right.
So my children were born 18 years ago.
God.
So they're old enough to express their opinions on me being a solo mum as well as my own.
Yes.
Although they're not here at the moment.
That's all right. I'm not going to make them come on the radio. That would be grossly unfair on every amount. It's bad enough. It's embarrassing enough having their mum ring in without me put them on as well.
Exactly. I won't tell them, so that's
Good.
okay.
So it was. I imagine it was a bigger deal 18 years ago than it would be now.
It was a huge deal, and I had treatment in the UK at first, although sadly I had 6 miscarriages before I hit the jackpot with my twins. But in 2004-5, a couple of clinics made me go in front of an ethics committee to see if I was fit to be a single parent. And I had to get my GP to sign a form to say that he thought I would not be mad, bad or dangerous, basically.
I know that adoptive families go through similar. So on one level, it makes sense. But that's when I compare you to an adopter, not when I compare you to someone who didn't go through IVF to become a parent. There's no ethics committees for them, is there?
No, and there's no ethics committees for normal. Well, I say normal, I don't mean that, but
I know what you mean.
for people who just make babies, just naturally make babies without a second thought.
So where did it? How long was the impulse growing before you sought the treatment?
Well, sadly, I'd had a miscarriage with a partner.
Right.
My dog barking. I had a miscarriage with a partner.
I could have worked that out myself, actually. But thanks for the running commentary. Go on.
That's okay. So I'd had a miscarriage with a partner, and that had made the loss of that baby, although we split up, made me think, wow, I'm over 40 and I'm not going to meet anyone. And if I do, I thought it'd be really unfair to sort of look at my watch and go, you know what, I'm meeting you because I'm desperate to have a baby.
Okay.
And so I took the pressure off that by doing it by myself. And it was a huge decision. I've never regretted it. The best thing I've ever done in my life. My kids are wonderful, but they're donor conceived. And I just wanted to stress that point, because not all solo mums do have a dad around. They have a donor, and although my kids are trying to find their genetic family through DNA, we didn't start off like that. We started off with no dad in our family. So,
How did you feel when they told you they wanted to try and find him?
I've always been open with them. I've told them they're donor conceived from birth, literally from when they were babies.
Sure.
And I'm really happy for them because, you have your own experience, James, of adoption. Not all adoptive people want to find their birth family, but because I was respectful to their feelings and they expressed curiosity, I was completely led by them. And at 12, they submitted DNA, and I'm completely supportive of that.
But to no avail so far, no results so far?
No, sadly, because they were conceived in Spain, and their donors are not from the UK, so it's much harder to find them, basically.
And how did your peer group greet this? How did your parents, if they were still around, how did people react when you said, I'm going to have babies on my own?
Well, I think because I'd lost so many trying, I did 7 IVF cycles with 6 miscarriages. I think it was awful. But I think my family just said, look, you're doing something you really want to do, and we will support you all the way. And when my babies were born, they've been treated no differently from anyone else in the family. And we've had nothing but full-throated support for what we've done. A lot of admiration as well, because it's hard being a parent of twins, let alone a
Yeah, well, it's hard when there's 2 of you. It's hard when there are 2 of you.
Exactly.
All parenting is hard. That's a nice story. I like that. It's kind of, but also, what you remind us of, the hell that you went through with regards to the failed cycles, but it still sounds like the most natural thing in the world. That impulse, that desire that you had, that overrode almost everything else in your life. I want to be a mum.
Exactly, and I now volunteer and work for an organisation called the Donor Conception Network, and they have about 700 single women in their charity who are either mums or trying to get pregnant at this moment. So the increase is real and very pertinent to life today, I think.
Indeed, and there are, it's interesting that you mentioned donor sperm, because, of course, the debate or the conversation is very different now from what it was 18 years ago. And I think there's been a sort of removal of anonymity, which was promised at the time, which is ethically, to go back to the ethics of it, really tricky to navigate, really tricky to negotiate. That's something we might get our teeth into another day. And it does, as Evie writes, it sounds like you're doing a great job. 12:30 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. What a selfless person this lady sounds, which is, as a parent, a great platform to build everything else from. More of your thoughts on this. Well, more of your experiences rather than thoughts on this, actually. What was it like when you decided to go it alone? How was it greeted, and what has it been like? Hit the numbers now, you will get through. Amelia Cox has your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
32 is the time. Do you know, speaking about things we used to do on this show, but we don't do anymore, there's a headline here that would have been probably my 10 o'clock back in the day. I 15 years. I've been doing this job for 20 years now. I know, unbelievable, I still look so young. But back in the day, this was one of my first hobby horses. In fact, I bumped into a lad from school And he said, I know what you're up to. I heard you the other day. You present shows about, and he thought all I did was this subject. He thought it was like my absolute obsession, almost as if I had a show dedicated to this issue. So anger over City's plan for Land Rover tax on big vehicles. Cardiff been accused of waging a war on motorists with the plans for a Land Rover tax that would result in owners of larger cars paying a premium to park. 20 years later, that story's come back. I felt then and still feel now that drivers of those ludicrously large SUVs or 4x4s, as we used to call them, I don't know what you call them now, I felt that they were incredibly obnoxious. Again, I was probably too rude in expressing myself because so many people drove them and I ended up offending people I didn't want to offend. But everything from the likelihood of injuring a pedestrian if you hit one right through to environmental impact, although that would be different now, and simply taking up so much of the road. And that's weird, isn't it? Because in later years, I've always insisted that we don't do motoring issues. And actually, one of the first subjects I can really remember, I suppose it's an anti-motoring. Maybe that's why it worked for us. Do you think we could do that now? Might find out tomorrow. Do you think would we do that now? Should drivers of these big obnoxious vehicles actually pay more to park than the rest of us do? I don't know. We're not doing it now. Don't ring in. Because we're talking about Chelsea tractors. That was the thing. The experience of single parenthood across the generations, but specifically when you decide, the decision to do it, the impact that it has, the way that society treats you. I'm getting some obnoxious messages in, as you might expect, someone describing single parents as the scourge of society. And do you think this is from a man or a woman? As long as the wannabe single mother does not entrap a man to pay her for the next 18 years for her lifestyle choice. Man or woman on that text? Yeah. Becky's in Worthing. Becky, what would you like to say?
Hello.
Hello, Becky.
I was born in 1965 to a mother who had got pregnant without being married.
Right.
And she had a very traditional Catholic family who more or less disowned her. My father didn't really want to know, so it was a non-starter. So she had me and went it alone. I didn't have a particularly great experience. All my friends obviously had two parents, and my mum actually worked in the film business, and I was away a lot, and I had nannies, and it didn't make for a great relationship, really.
And if there'd been two parents and one was at home while the other was away, it would have been a very different experience.
Yeah, I would have loved it, would have absolutely loved it. So I didn't have a particularly great relationship. Didn't meet my dad until I was an adult.
Did you track him down?
Well, no. Unbeknown to me, he had been attempting to keep in contact via my mum, but she never told me that he was trying to keep in contact.
Because he might not have wanted a relationship with her, but that didn't mean that he didn't want a relationship with you, which is another burden to bear, isn't it, through life? Yeah. How conscious were you? Were you acutely conscious of the difference between? Because you're 7 years older than me, Becky, and that is an era where we didn't even know that many divorced people, especially not in a Catholic congregation. No. But were you acutely aware of how different you were?
Absolutely aware, and it blighted my whole early years, really, and young adulthood. And all I ever wanted to do was get married, and I've been married 32 years.
There's a happy end. Well, I hope there's that. Is he all right? Is he okay? Yeah. It's not too late to change your mind, Becky.
No, it definitely is. No, there's no going back now. No.
And did people treat you? Was it something? I don't know if you were listening yesterday when a caller who was Ethiopian told us about being teased for being Ethiopian when Band-Aid came out. So anything that marks a child as different can be grounds for teasing or even bullying at school. But would it be something that other children picked up on?
Oh, definitely. The best one was, you don't have a dad, do you? Wow. Oh, hang on. Is your dad in prison?
Gosh.
It was terrible. And I must admit, I'm a little bit concerned. This isn't going to be popular, but I'm a bit concerned about parents that choose to go it alone now.
I don't think...
Even though it's very, very different
No,
these
but
days.
you can't not be, given your background, given your experiences, because you're worried that another child would go through what you went through, and it comes from the goodness of your heart to hope that they don't. But at the same time, it's a very different society from the one in which your mother decided to have you. Did you ever find out why? I mean, why she was so determined to go ahead with what was at the time a very rare path?
Yeah, she was a career girl, and I think she wanted to prove to her parents that she could do it.
So it was a very early attempt to have it all, as they say.
Yes, definitely.
But from your point of view, it didn't work.
Yes, it had a detrimental effect, and we ended up being estranged, and she died last year, and we hadn't seen each other for a very long time. Oh. And ironically, my father is still alive and doesn't live that far from me, but he's a bit of a wrong 'un.
God, I can't wait for your memoir.
Yes.
I'm looking forward to that. Becky, thank you. And that, you see, that I suppose is what I would describe as a generous objection or a generous quibble. Is I'm not quite sure this is such a good thing that everyone should be encouraging, because loneliness, simple. That's the first thing I heard in Becky's call. And the research done into the emotional or financial welfare of children always points to higher levels of both in so-called nuclear families or in families with two parents. But they wouldn't they? Because of attitudes like the ones that Becky's encountered as a child. So you can only really make that comparison when society has evolved to a point where there's no stigma and no judgment. So if you're growing up in an atmosphere of stigma, you're already having a less pleasant experience than the children growing up in an atmosphere where there is no stigma. So these things are often tricky. And of course, if you found out that children of parents with an income of over £75,000 a year or over £100,000 a year were scoring higher on emotional well-being or physical health charts, nobody would turn around and use that as an argument against parents on under £100,000 a year being able to have children. So you've got to be conscious of what pitfalls of prejudice you might be falling into without realising. Not suggesting for a minute that Becky did. And yes, you're all right. It was a man that sent in the message. As long as the wannabe single mother does not entrap a man to pay for the next 18 years for her lifestyle choice. Yes, George. I don't think you've got much to worry about. Harriet's in Dereham in Norfolk. Harriet, what would you like to say?
Hi there.
Hello,
firstly, I just want to say that I do have a Chelsea tractor.
We're not having that phone in today. Also, you're in Dereham. That's fine. I know Dereham. It's quite hard to get around that part of Norfolk without four-wheel drive. But if you parked in my car park, Harriet, I'd expect you to pay double. But we may do that conversation. Go on.
I would park over two spaces, obviously.
Yes.
It's my prerogative as a Chelsea tractor driver.
There it is. And we don't like stereotypes on this programme. I'm very grateful to you for telling the unvarnished truth. Now, about your personal life.
Right, I was going to say 16 years ago, I fell pregnant. I was in a bit of an odd relationship, let's just say. And I made the decision very quickly that I was going to have this child on my own. The dad didn't want anything to do with him at that time.
Right.
And I said, yep, that's absolutely fine. I'm more than happy to do this on my own. I feel confident. I had a great amount of support from family and friends who all agreed that I was more than capable of doing this on my own. Anyway,
did your mum and dad were up for it?
Yes, everybody was.
Don't say it like that as if I've said something that's because it's quite a big deal to go home to mum and dad and say I'm pregnant, I'm going to have a baby on my own, because they know how hard it will be, not with any moral judgment, but just how tough it could be for you.
Yeah, I think. No, everybody was fine with it.
That's
I mean,
nice.
Nobody showed me any sort of negative. Yeah, I got nothing. Anyway, so that was all brilliant, and I was more than prepared to have him on my own. And then something happened with the relationship with his dad, and we ended up actually getting together right at the end of the pregnancy, which lasted for 2 years. He was abusive. It was a sort of coercive control relationship and all that. Anyway, 2 years we were together. So I did 2 years in a relationship where he obviously didn't want to be there. He didn't want to be the dad. So I basically did everything on my own anyway. And then I did the next 4 years as a single mum, knowing that it had been my choice anyway.
Yes.
And in that time, although I loved it and I don't regret having my son at all, obviously, I found it really draining, really, really hard. And I used to look at other mums around me and think, oh my God, you get to just sit down occasionally.
You can turn off.
You
can turn it off sometimes.
I didn't feel like I could ever just stop, and I was working and obviously doing the school runs and all this, and I was lucky in that I had a lot of support from my parents and my sisters and all of this, but it was just, I found it really, really hard and really tiring. Anyway, not in the search for somebody to help me, obviously. I did find, I did have a new relationship. We're now married and have a daughter together who's 8. And that's... And
so you've done all
fantastic.
3 then? You've done unhealthy relationship.
Yeah.
You've done single parenthood, and now you're doing healthy relationship with a side order of extra parenthood. And I don't think there are any prizes for guessing which of the 3 you prefer.
I much prefer having somebody who I can just go, oh, I'm done. Can you take over now, please?
Yes.
And I just find it, and I have friends that I actually have a very good friend who is single mum by choice, by donor, and she's managing it fantastically and doing really, really well. But it just wasn't for me, and I think a lot of mums might keep it to themselves and say, oh yeah, no, I love it. But actually, at the end of the day, you think, oh God, I just wish I had somebody to
help.
pick up the slack.
Somebody to help me. I mean, there'd be parents in relationships who find it unbearable sometimes and wish that they'd never done it. But I guess it just becomes magnified when you're on your own. So when you hear a story like the one today, like a big uptick in the number of women seeking to become single parents with donor or IVF, there's probably a little bit of you that thinks you might give them a bit of a chat or just tell them
I think what I would say is just really get a brilliant support network around you. I mean, I did have a good support network, but it still wasn't enough for working full time and bringing up a child on your own. And maybe it's just a personal thing, but I found it really hard.
Well, it is a personal thing, but it's also an experience that will be relevant to others in similar situations. You know, everything is doubled. It's odd that the first caller had twins, so that means it's doubled. It's quadrupled, isn't it? Because you don't get to split the burden of parenting, and it's immediately twofold because you've got twins. But yeah, I mean, crikey, loads of parents. Haven't even mentioned postpartum depression, which can kick in whether you're having a child with someone else or whether you're having a child on your own. Harriet, thank you, and happy driving.
James O'Brien on LBC.
48 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I don't know. I got to be honest. Damien in Watford, very keen to have a big SUV phone in. He points out that flip headlights were stopped on sports cars due to the danger that they posed in pedestrian accidents, but I can drive a completely unnecessary high metal wall at pedestrians with no problems whatsoever. And Tim, I like this. I think otters build dams. Tim's picking up on this. Everyone's a pedant these days. James, I know this is probably too late, but I'm running about 90 minutes behind on catch-up, which means that he won't hear this for another 90 minutes. So everyone say something rude about Tim, if you want. I'm not that rude, Keith. Honestly. But do otters build dams? No, otters do not build dams. They may use abandoned dams, but they are aquatic mammals that prefer to live in dens called holts. That's what... badgers live in holts as well, I think, don't they? Which are often located near the shoreline. These dens can have underwater entrances and multiple tunnels for quick entry and exit. Otters may also den in hollow logs. Beavers build dams, writes Tim in the Vale of Beaver, which is spelt, I often tell you about this stuff, it's spelt in a way to allow us plebs to identify ourselves. It's spelt Belvoir, so you would pronounce it Belvoir, and snobs would then go, oh, listen to him, I bet he grew up in Kidderminster, he doesn't know how to pronounce Beaver, everyone knows it's the Vale of Beaver. So there you have it, Beaver News, live from Tim in the Vale of Beaver, but also Otter News as well. If you are just tuning in now, I'm sorry, there's no earthly way I'm going to be able to contextualise this last couple of minutes of radio, and in fact by the time Tim gets here in 90 minutes, he'll probably be just as confused as you are. But hey-ho, all human life is here. Joe's in Greenwich to steer us back to the conversation about single parenthood, particularly conscious or deliberate single parenthood. Joe, what would you like to say?
So I had 2 children via donor conception, and I've had a third one recently where I got into a relationship that went south. So I'm probably going to raise of the kids now without a father.
Yeah.
But there's a very big network out there. I'm part of the group, so we call ourselves Single Mothers by Choice. And as well as, I don't know if you heard of the gingerbreads, which is just a normal kind of single parent community.
Yes, that goes way back, doesn't it?
Way back. So I've made a lot of friends this way.
Nice.
You had a lady on that was speaking about the donor conception network as well.
Yes.
So we're all kind of interlinked in a sense. I think it depends on where you are in the country, but you're probably going to start seeing more and more of us and what we're doing.
So I don't know how young or how old your youngest is, but what about stigma? Was there stigma when you made this decision, when you announced this decision, when you present as a single parent in spaces where most of the mums will be in relationships?
I think I lost most of my friends in couples who are coupled up.
Wow,
and
really?
I've well, consciously or deliberately, I don't know why, but I've surrounded myself with single parents. Even my childminder is a single parent. She's got 3 children of her own as well.
Why?
I feel like relationships just fall apart. I feel like old school love and romance that was there is just, it's not something that's part of modern society. It's too much instant gratification and people aren't loyal anymore. So,
well, there's lots of evidence out there that's not universally true. I was asking. I mean, there is. I mean, there's me for a start. But the question was more about the question was more about why you've chosen to not have friends in your circle. Different. Why you've chosen?
I want my children not to feel left out. I kind of want them to feel that that they're not different.
Yeah.
Because this has been happening for years.
Yes.
Consciously or unconsciously, where women have been raising children. The statistics on that is massive.
Yeah, no, I hear it. I'm a little, what would the word be? Dismayed by your bleak depiction of the death of romance in the first quarter of the 21st century. There are still people falling in love, and still, I think, I don't know if it's the more common parenting experience anymore, but it's certainly still very, very common for children to be raised in. The problem is, if I say the word loving, that's quite judgmental, isn't it? As I say, because your home is loving.
Yes, very.
And you say in a loving home or raised by, because there could be 2 parents in a home who are bloody awful.
Exactly, yeah. Like, it could be, yeah.
But you're right, though. That's all of the single mothers who sound like they're getting it right, and none of the ones we've spoken to sound like they're getting it wrong, speak about the importance of a support network, which is, of course, what a relationship is, but this is a different kind of support network. And now I've started a debate about whether or not badgers live in holts. Maybe they don't. I know they also live in sets, but I thought they also lived in holts. I don't know why I bother trying to educate you lot sometimes. Thank you, Joe. Joanna, from Joe to Joanna, is in Camden. Joanna, what would you like to say?
Hello, James.
Hello,
First
Joanna.
time caller.
Oh, welcome aboard. It's only me.
Thank you.
What do badgers live in?
I don't know.
Oh, that's all right then. Carry on. Badger houses. I don't know either, as I've just advertised on the radio. What made you pick up the phone today, Joanna?
I'm 44. I had my son 9 years ago on my own. I just wanted to say that for me, it's the best thing I've ever done, the thing I'm most proud of.
Yeah.
But also, I don't know that I'd recommend it to anybody else, because I feel inevitably it's made my last decade really different and at times difficult. I did it because I hadn't met somebody and I wanted to have a child.
Yes. I think that's probably the most common impulse, isn't it?
Yes. And I didn't want the ticking time clock and, just to be motivated by that.
No.
But I haven't met somebody since, and I think I'd maybe underestimated the sheer, just always being in the evenings and just how difficult it is to meet somebody when I got a child, and most of my friends are all in couples.
So you're saying that you didn't have a really full picture of what life was likely to be like, I think.
I was probably slightly naive, and I maybe compounded my own issues when I got a job offer when he was 1 and went to Australia, and I took the job offer. But
so you cut yourself off from whatever support network you had and really went solo. How did that work out?
Okay.
Right.
It was good for 4 years, but there were times when, as people have said, I think it just at weekends and things, having zero family support and constantly having to look after what was then a toddler, it was just quite exhausting. You know, it was literally working and being a mum, and I didn't have any of me really left after all of that.
Yeah.
And I don't need to paint a bleak picture. And I adore my son, and they don't regret it for a second.
No, you haven't done that. Don't worry. You haven't. I'm not sitting there thinking, "Oh dear, don't think she likes him." You've done what all parents do, actually, whether they're on their own or not. You've just sort of described the discovery of the stuff that no one really warned you about. But if you are on your own, it's just bigger, isn't it?
It is. And also people, I think because I made the decision and I didn't really discuss it too much with anybody beforehand, to my family and things, it fell into a picture of Joanna, she's strong, she's independent, she gets on with things.
Yes.
And this plays into that narrative, but people perhaps don't see that you're vulnerable and need help, particularly as this was your choice.
Yes, that's beautifully put. And you know, it again, it's a generous observation because you're presuming people would like to do the right thing, but don't think that it's needed to be done, and the reasons for that are complicated and to do with you as much to do with them. And sometimes asking is the hardest thing. And even if you do ask, they may not believe that you're kind of in as much need as you are, or in as much need of support as you are, because you're coping so well, because you're doing such a great job.
And then so that takes a kind of you then perpetuate that because you also want to be seen like you're thriving and coping.
Yes.
But I don't ask for help, and there are times when I think, I would just love that. I would like to be offered help rather than having to ask for it.
Yeah, I get, and these are experiences that people in more traditional would not share. In more traditional parenting scenarios, would not have that set, because not least because it would be to each other that you would turn when support or help was needed. Thank you, Jan. You made your case beautifully, and I promise you didn't in any way paint it bleakly or any of those things. In fact, you know, I'll take away the memory that you described it as by far the best thing you've ever done, although a couple of you are drawn to the idea of a phone-in that invites parents to tell us that they don't like their own children. I'll let you do that, shall I? Is that one for you?
Well, we all have to, I mean, I don't have children, but I'm sure my mum used to say to me, when she was disappointed in me or upset with me as a kid, mostly, I think, I love you, but I don't like you at the moment. That's what she used to say.
We know what that means. That's not the same, is it? Well, I suppose it is, but you mean
a continuum of not liking
can't turn
somebody.
off love, but you could dislike someone forever.
God, imagine that if it was your kid.
It'd be awful. Oof. All right, thank you. If you missed any of today's show, on that cheerful note, I've done all the other business. I've done the missing word rounds. I've done, okay, we're good. So that's 2 phone-ins tomorrow. Should 4x4s pay more for parking? And do you hate your children? If you missed any of...
Hang on, it works the other way around. What if you really can't stand your parents or your parents?
That works too. That's more common.
It is more common,
and I've got some of that in my inbox today, actually. Yeah. And that's an argument against being too judgmental about single parents, because there's plenty of people getting in touch with 2 parents who were both awful. Oh, all human life is here. I've got to stop saying that. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, where you can also pause and rewind live radio, as well as listen to a range of podcasts. Download it now for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Tom Sorbitt with you at 4, but now, as you may have gathered, Sheila Fogarty is in the house.
James O'Brien on LBC.